Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another chilling collection of forgotten accounts buried deep in the shadows of time. In this episode, we will dive deep into the heart of American small towns with 6 harrowing tales of the most disturbing true horror stories that have emerged from these seemingly quiet communities. Each narrative has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from first-hand testimonies of residents who lived through these terrifying experiences in places where everyone knows your name, but nobody knows your secrets. These are the confessions of ordinary people who witnessed extraordinary evil in towns, with populations that could fit in a high school gymnasium. To protect the identities of those involved, some names and locations have been carefully altered, but the core truth of each account remains intact. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what really happens when the sun sets on small-town America. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the darkest files that small communities tried to bury forever. I delivered mail in Millfield for 12 years. And I thought I knew every secret in that town. When you walk the same routes day after day, season after season, you become part of the landscape. People wave from their windows, leave you cold drinks in summer, and shovel paths to their mailboxes in winter. You learn which houses get medical supply deliveries, which ones have college kids coming home, and which ones never seem to get anything but bills and catalogs. But there was something happening on Elm Street that took me 12 years to notice, and another 6 months to understand. Millfield is the kind of place where 3,000 people call home, where Main Street has more empty storefronts than open businesses, and where everyone knows your business before you do. It sits in a valley between 2 hills, surrounded by maple forests that turn the whole town gold every October. The kind of place people drive through on their way to somewhere else, never stopping long enough to see what lurks beneath the surface. My route covered the whole town, but Elm Street was always my favorite. 12 houses lined up in a perfect row, each one built in the 1940s with identical front porches and small front yards. The residents were mostly older folks who had lived there for decades. Mrs. Patterson at number 4 always had her porch light on and would wave from her kitchen window. Mr. Rodriguez at number 8 kept the most immaculate garden I had ever seen. The Hendersons at number 12 had lived there since they were newlyweds in 1963. For 11 years, I delivered their mail without paying much attention to the details. Bills, magazines, the occasional package. Normal small-town postal delivery. But during my 12th year, something started nagging at me. It was March when I first noticed it, a subtle pattern that my subconscious had been tracking long before my rational mind caught up. Every 3rd Thursday of the month, without fail, each house on Elm Street received an identical package. Same size, same weight, same return address that I could never quite make out through the smudged ink. The packages were wrapped in brown paper, about the size of a hardcover book, and they always arrived on the same delivery truck from the regional sorting facility. 12 packages, 12 houses, every 3rd Thursday, like clockwork. At first, I assumed it was some kind of subscription service, maybe a book club or vitamin delivery. Small towns have their quirks, and if all the residents of one street wanted to order the same thing, that was their business. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. These people barely talked to each other. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen from number 6 had been in a property line dispute for 15 years. The Rodriguezes kept to themselves, and the young couple at number 10 had only moved in 2 years ago. The return address was always the same, but I could never read it clearly. The ink looked deliberately smudged, as if someone had run their thumb across it while it was still wet. I tried holding the packages up to the light in my truck, but the brown paper was too thick to see through. The weight was consistent, maybe 2 pounds, and they never rattled when I shook them gently. By May, my curiosity was getting the better of me. I started paying closer attention to the residents on Elm Street, especially on package delivery days. Mrs. Patterson would usually meet me at the mailbox with a smile and a comment about the weather. But on third Thursdays, she would stay inside until I left, then quickly retrieve her package. Through her front window, I could see her carrying it straight to her basement door. The same thing happened at every house. No one came out to greet me on package days. No one left their packages sitting on the porch like they usually did with other deliveries. Within minutes of my departure, I would see curtains twitch and front doors open just long enough for the packages to disappear inside. I started keeping a mental log. March 18th, April 15th, May 20th, June 17th. Always the third Thursday, always 12 identical packages. I began timing my route differently on those days, parking at the end of Elm Street where I could observe the houses after making my deliveries. Every single resident followed the same pattern. Quick retrieval, straight into the house, curtains drawn tight for the rest of the day. The breakthrough came in July when I was delivering a certified letter to Mrs. Patterson. She was expecting her Social Security documents and had asked me to bring them to her door instead of leaving them in the mailbox. When she answered, I could smell something strange coming from inside her house. It was not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Sweet and herbal, like burning sage mixed with something medicinal. "Busy day today, Mrs. Patterson?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked nervous for the first time in 12 years. "Oh, you know how it is, Thomas. Just some spring cleaning." But it was July, and the smell was definitely not cleaning supplies. That evening, I drove back to Elm Street after my shift ended. Every house was dark except for a strange, flickering glow coming from the basement windows. Not electric light, but something softer, like candles or oil lamps. And if I strained my ears, I could hear a low humming sound, like multiple voices chanting in unison. I parked across the street and watched for over an hour. The flickering lights moved in synchronized patterns, and the humming would rise and fall in waves. At exactly 11 o'clock, everything stopped. The lights went out, the humming ceased, and normal house lights began turning on throughout the street. August came, and with it, another delivery of 12 identical packages. This time, I was ready. I had borrowed a small digital camera from my nephew and planned to document whatever was happening. But when I arrived at Elm Street that Thursday morning, something was different. Mrs. Patterson was waiting at her mailbox, but she was not alone. Mr. Rodriguez stood at his mailbox at number 8. The Hendersons were at number 12. In fact, all 12 residents of Elm Street were standing at their mailboxes, watching me approach. They did not speak as I delivered their packages. They just stood there, 12 pairs of eyes following my every movement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the pavement and the rustle of paper as I placed each package in its designated mailbox. When I finished and returned to my truck, they were still standing there, still watching. I started the engine and began to drive away. But in my rearview mirror, I could see them forming a circle in the middle of the street. They were opening their packages in unison, removing identical items that I could not make out from that distance. That night, I could not sleep. Something was seriously wrong on Elm Street, and I had been unknowingly facilitating it for months. I decided to research the return address on the packages, even though it was barely legible. It took me 3 days of squinting at delivery labels before I could make out enough letters to attempt a search. The address traced back to a post office box in Salem, Massachusetts, registered to something called the Millfield Heritage Society. I had never heard of any heritage society in our town, and when I asked around, no one else had either. The postmaster in Salem was helpful, but could only tell me that the box had been rented for over 30 years, always paid in cash, always by different people. I started digging into Millfield's history, spending my evenings at the town library and searching through old records. What I found chilled me to the bone. Elm Street had been built on land that was once the site of the original Millfield settlement, founded in 1692 by refugees from the Salem witch trials. According to the records, 12 families had fled Salem and established a small community in the Vermont wilderness. They had built their homes in a circle and practiced what they called the old ways, away from the prying eyes of Puritan authorities. The settlement had prospered for decades, but in 1734, something had gone wrong. The official records were vague, mentioning only that the settlement had been abandoned due to crop failures and harsh winters. But I found a diary entry from a traveling minister who had visited the area in 1735. He wrote about finding the abandoned houses still standing, but with strange symbols carved into the wooden beams and scorch marks on the floors where fires had burned in perfect circles. The minister had also noted that the graves in the settlement cemetery contained no bodies, 12 headstones, 12 empty graves, and no explanation for what had happened to the families who had once lived there. By September, I was becoming obsessed with the mystery of Elm Street. I had convinced myself that the current residents were part of some kind of historical reenactment group or genealogical society. Maybe they were descendants of the original settlers, honoring their ancestors with monthly gatherings. It was strange, but not necessarily sinister. But then came the third Thursday in September, and everything changed. I arrived at Elm Street to find it deserted. No residents waiting at their mailboxes, no curtains twitching in windows, no signs of life at all. The packages were in my truck as usual. But when I stepped out to begin deliveries, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every single house on Elm Street was identical now. Not just similar in architecture, but perfectly identical. The paint was the same shade of white on every house, the shutters the same shade of green, the front porches exactly the same height and width. Even the landscaping was identical, with the same flowers planted in the same patterns in every yard. I had been walking this street for 12 years, and I knew every house by heart. Mrs. Patterson's house had always had blue shutters. The Rodriguezes had replaced their front steps with brick ones just 2 years ago. The Hendersons had a distinctive oak tree in their front yard that was older than the house itself. Now, all of those individual details were gone. 12 identical houses, as if they had all been built yesterday using the same blueprint. I stood in the middle of the street, packages clutched in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That was when I noticed the mailboxes. Each one had a name printed on it in identical block letters. But they were not the names of the people I had been delivering mail to for 12 years. Patterson, Rodriguez, Henderson, and all the others were gone. Instead, the mailboxes bore the names I had found in the historical records: Whitmore, Blackwood, Ashworth, and 9 others that matched the original Salem refugee families. I should have left then. I should have driven straight to the police station and reported what I had seen. Instead, I found myself walking up to the first house, the one that had belonged to Mrs. Patterson. The package felt heavier in my hands than it should have, and I could swear I felt something moving inside it. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman stood there, and for a moment, I thought it was Mrs. Patterson. But this woman was younger, maybe in her 30s, with the same facial features but darker hair and clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum. She was wearing a long black dress with a white collar, and her hair was pulled back in a style I had seen in old portraits. "You have been faithful in your service, Thomas Richardson," she said in a voice that sounded like Mrs. Patterson, but spoke with an accent I could not place. "The time has come for you to join us." Behind her, through the doorway, I could see the interior of the house. It was not Mrs. Patterson's living room with its floral wallpaper and modern furniture. Instead, I glimpsed a room lit by oil lamps, with rough wooden furniture and herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. I stumbled backward, dropping the packages on the porch. They hit the wooden boards with a sound like breaking glass, and a thick, dark liquid began seeping out of the torn brown paper. The smell that rose from the spilled contents was overwhelming, metallic and organic, like blood mixed with rich soil. "Do not be afraid," the woman who looked like Mrs. Patterson continued. "We have been waiting for you to understand, waiting for you to see. You have been chosen to carry our messages, to help us maintain the connection between worlds. The packages you have delivered contain the essence of the old settlement, the blood and bone of our ancestors, mixed with the herbs of our craft." I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear doors opening along the entire street, and voices calling my name in unison. Not the voices of the people I had known for 12 years, but older voices, speaking in harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. I made it to my truck and drove away as fast as I could. But in my rearview mirror, I could see 12 figures standing in the middle of Elm Street. They were not the residents I had known, but people in old-fashioned clothing, holding hands in a circle around the spilled contents of the packages I had dropped. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and called the police. But when they arrived at Elm Street 20 minutes later, they found nothing unusual. 12 normal houses with 12 normal residents who claimed they had no idea what I was talking about. The officers said I seemed stressed and suggested I take some time off from work. The next day, I requested a transfer to a different route. I could not bring myself to go back to Elm Street, not after what I had seen. My supervisor was understanding and assigned me to the industrial district on the other side of town. But that was not the end of it. 2 weeks later, I received a package at my own home. Same brown paper wrapping, same smudged return address, same weight and size as the ones I had been delivering to Elm Street. My name was written on it, in the same block letters I had seen on the mailboxes that day. I never opened it. I took it straight to the police station and demanded they investigate. But they treated me like a man having a nervous breakdown. The package sat on the evidence shelf for a month before they returned it to me, claiming there was nothing suspicious about a resident receiving mail. When I got home, I built a fire in my backyard and burned the package without opening it. The flames turned green when they touched the brown paper, and the smoke smelled like the herbs I had detected in Mrs. Patterson's house. As it burned, I could swear I heard voices whispering in the crackling flames, calling my name and promising that I would return to Elm Street eventually. That was 6 months ago. I moved to a different town, got a job at a hardware store, and tried to forget about Millfield and Elm Street. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of packages being delivered to my door. When I look outside, there is nothing there, but I can smell that herbal scent drifting through my window. And sometimes, when I am driving through small towns on my way to work, I see familiar faces in the windows of houses I pass. faces that looked like Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, and the Hendersons, but wearing clothes from centuries past, watching me with eyes that seemed to know exactly where I am and what I am trying to forget. I know they are still waiting for me on Elm Street, waiting for me to understand that some routes, once walked, can never truly be abandoned. The mail must always be delivered, and some messages are too important to remain unread. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened during the lockdown drill at Cedar Falls Elementary, least of all the other school board members. But as the newest member of the board, I thought it was my responsibility to ask the hard questions. Martha Hendricks, that is my name, and I had been elected just 6 months earlier on a platform of transparency and child safety. The parents in Cedar Falls trusted me to be their voice, to make sure their children were protected and educated properly. I wish I had never opened that door. Some secrets are buried so deep that digging them up destroys everything you thought you knew about the place you call home. Cedar Falls is one of those Montana towns that exists because it has to, not because anyone particularly wants it to. 800 people scattered across a valley that gets snowed in for 4 months of the year, surrounded by mountains that look beautiful on postcards, but feel like prison walls when you live between them. The elementary school serves the whole county, bringing in kids from ranches and tiny settlements spread across 50 square miles. It is the heart of our community, the one place where everyone comes together. I had lived in Cedar Falls my whole life, raised 3 children who graduated from that same elementary school, and spent 15 years volunteering for everything from bake sales to field trips. When longtime board member Jim Patterson announced his retirement, everyone assumed I would run for his seat. I won by a landslide, mainly because nobody else wanted the job. School board meetings in small towns are usually exercises in bureaucratic tedium, arguing about budget allocations and maintenance schedules. But my first meeting in September changed everything I thought I knew about our little school and the people who ran it. The other 4 board members had all served for years. Principal Janet Morrison had been there since before my oldest child started kindergarten. Superintendent Dr. William Chen oversaw 3 small schools across the county and treated Cedar Falls Elementary like his personal kingdom. Board Chairman Robert Fitzgerald owned the largest ranch in the area and carried himself like he owned the town too. The only other woman on the board, Susan Walsh, taught high school in the next town over and rarely spoke during meetings. Before we begin tonight's regular business, Dr. Chen announced at that September meeting, we need to review some security footage from last month's lockdown drill. He gestured to a television that had been wheeled into the conference room. Just routine documentation for our safety protocols. I had heard about the lockdown drill, of course. It had happened on a Tuesday in late August, just before school started for the year. The teachers had been preparing their classrooms when the alarm system activated, and they had followed standard procedures for securing the building. Nothing unusual about it, or so I had been told. Dr. Chen pressed play on the remote, and grainy black and white footage filled the screen. The timestamp showed August 28th, 2:15 in the afternoon. I could see teachers moving quickly through the hallways, checking that doors were locked and windows were covered. Everything looked exactly like what you would expect from a well-executed safety drill. The teachers responded perfectly, Principal Morrison noted, making a mark on her clipboard. Average response time was under 90 seconds across all classrooms. I was taking notes, trying to be diligent in my new role, when I noticed something that made me pause. "Wait," I said, pointing at the screen. "Can you rewind that last part?" Dr. Chen looked annoyed, but complied. The footage rewound to show the main hallway outside the kindergarten classrooms. Teachers were moving efficiently from room to room, but in the corner of the frame, I could see something that did not make sense. "There," I said, leaning forward. "Those 3 children in the hallway. Why are they not in a classroom during a lockdown?" The other board members exchanged glances. Chairman Fitzgerald cleared his throat. "Martha, these are just the details we work through in post-drill analysis. Nothing to be concerned about." But I was concerned. The 3 children on the footage appeared to be elementary age, walking calmly down the hallway while teachers were rushing to implement lockdown procedures. They were not running or hiding or showing any of the urgency that the situation should have demanded. They were just walking, almost casually, toward what looked like the rear exit of the building. "Who are those children?" I asked. "And why are they leaving the building during a lockdown?" Susan Walsh spoke up for the first time that evening. "Martha, these drills can be confusing. Sometimes protocols are not followed perfectly, and we make adjustments for next time. I made a note to ask for a list of all students who had been in the building that day. Something about the footage bothered me, though I could not put my finger on exactly what. The 3 children looked familiar, but I could not place them. Cedar Falls is small enough that I know most of the families, at least by sight. "I would like copies of this footage for my records," I announced. "As board members, we should all have access to materials that document safety procedures." Dr. Chen's response was immediate and firm. "These recordings contain sensitive security information. They remain in district custody only." That response raised more red flags. In my previous volunteer work with the school, I had never encountered resistance to reasonable requests for documentation. But Chairman Fitzgerald was already moving on to budget items, and my attempts to return to the topic were smoothly deflected. Over the next few weeks, I could not shake my unease about those 3 children. I started paying closer attention to enrollment records and attendance sheets, trying to identify who had been in the building that day. The official documentation showed that 12 teachers and 2 maintenance staff had been present for the drill, but there was no mention of any children. When I asked Principal Morrison directly about student presence during the drill, she seemed confused. "Students. Martha, the drill was conducted during our professional development week. No children were in the building. But I had seen them clearly on the footage. 3 elementary-age children walking calmly through the hallway while teachers implemented lockdown procedures. Either Principal Morrison was mistaken about the date, or something else was happening that no one wanted to discuss. I decided to do my own investigation. Cedar Falls is small enough that unusual events create ripples throughout the community. And if 3 children had been in the school during what was supposed to be a staff-only day, someone would remember. I started asking casual questions during my weekly trips to the grocery store, the post office, and the diner on Main Street. The responses I received were strange and inconsistent. When I asked Linda Rodriguez at the post office if she remembered anything unusual happening at the school in late August, she got a distant look in her eyes and said, "Now that you mention it, I did see some kids walking down Maple Street that Tuesday afternoon. Thought it was odd since school had not started yet." "Do you remember what they looked like?" I pressed. Linda paused for a long moment, like she was trying to recall a dream. 3 of them, I think, walking together. But I cannot quite remember their faces. Similar conversations throughout town yielded the same pattern. People remembered seeing children that day, but no one could provide specific details about who they were or where they had gone. It was as if the entire town had a collective blind spot about 3 specific kids. My breakthrough came when I was reviewing the school's enrollment records from the past several years. I was looking for patterns, trying to identify which families might have children who would have been in the building that day for any reason. That was when I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. 3 children had been enrolled at Cedar Falls Elementary for the previous school year, but had not returned in the fall. Emma Sullivan, age 7, Michael Patterson, age 9, and Zoe Chen, age 6. According to the records, all 3 had moved away during the summer with their families. But when I cross-referenced their information with county records, I found no documentation of any family moves, no forwarding addresses, and no transfer requests to schools in other districts. Emma Sullivan's family had lived in the same house for 12 years. Michael Patterson's father worked at the grain elevator and had no reason to relocate. Zoe Chen was Dr. Chen's own niece, living with her grandparents after her parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier. I called the numbers on file for all 3 families. Emma Sullivan's phone had been disconnected. Michael Patterson's father claimed he had never heard of me and hung up when I mentioned the school board. But it was the call to Zoe Chen's grandparents that confirmed my worst fears. "Zoe?" Mrs. Chen's voice was shaky and confused. "We have not seen Zoe since..." When was it? I cannot seem to remember. She was here, and then she was not. The doctors said it was grief making us forget, but we know she existed. We have her things, her pictures. I drove to the Chen house that same afternoon. The elderly couple invited me in, and what I saw broke my heart. Zoe's bedroom was perfectly preserved, as if she had just stepped out for a few minutes. But when I looked closely at the family photographs displayed throughout the house, I noticed something disturbing. In every photo that should have included Zoe, there was a strange blur or shadow, as if someone had been carefully erased from the images. "She was right there," Mr. Chen kept saying, pointing to empty spaces in photographs. "We remember her being right there." That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Chairman Fitzgerald. I presented him with everything I had discovered: the missing children, the inconsistent records, the gaps in everyone's memory. His response was not what I expected. "Martha," he said in a tone that was patient but firm, "you are dealing with a very sensitive situation that requires careful handling. Some matters are best left to those with experience in these areas." "What kind of sensitive situation involves 3 missing children and altered records?" I demanded. Fitzgerald was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was making a decision. Finally, he spoke. "Meet me at the school tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. Come alone, and I will show you what really happened during that lockdown drill." I should have brought someone with me. I should have called the state police or the FBI or anyone with authority beyond our little county. Instead, I drove to Cedar Falls Elementary alone on a cold October night, my hands shaking as I unlocked the front door with the key I had been given as a board member. Chairman Fitzgerald was waiting in the main hallway with Principal Morrison and Dr. Chen. The building felt different at night, shadows stretching longer than they should and familiar spaces taking on ominous shapes. "Before we show you the complete footage," Dr. Chen said, "you need to understand the history of this building. Cedar Falls Elementary was built in 1952 on land that had previously been used for other purposes. The county purchased the property from a private organization that had operated here for many years." He led me to the library, where a projector had been set up. The screen displayed a series of photographs that looked like they had been taken decades earlier. Black and white images of the same building, but with different signage and different people. From 1928 to 1951, this was the Cedar Falls Institute for Exceptional Children, Dr. Chen continued. It was a residential facility for children with what were then called developmental disabilities, but it also served as a research center for experimental treatments. The photographs showed children in institutional clothing, standing in rows in front of the building that was now our elementary school. Their faces were blank and distant, and many appeared to be heavily medicated. The institute was closed after a state investigation revealed irregularities in their treatment methods. Principal Morrison added, 23 children who had been residents simply vanished during the final week of operation. No records of where they went, no family claims, no documentation of transfers to other facilities. I felt sick as the implications began to sink in. You are telling me that children disappeared from this building 70 years ago, and now 3 more children have vanished? Chairman Fitzgerald activated the projector remote, and new footage filled the screen. This was not the edited version I had seen at the board meeting. This was raw security camera footage from multiple angles, showing the entire sequence of events during the August lockdown drill. The footage began normally, with teachers implementing lockdown procedures throughout the building. But at the 2-minute mark, something extraordinary happened. 3 children simply materialized in the main hallway, not walking in from another room, not emerging from hiding places. They appeared out of thin air, like smoke condensing into solid form. Emma Sullivan, Michael Patterson, and Zoe Chen stood in the hallway for several seconds, looking around with expressions of confusion and fear. Then they began walking toward the rear exit, their movements mechanical and synchronized, like they were being controlled by an external force. "The building remembers," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Every few years, usually during times of stress or change, the Institute reasserts itself. The children who vanished in 1951 are still here, still trapped in the building's memory. And sometimes, they take living children back with them." The footage continued, showing the 3 children reaching the rear exit. But instead of opening the door and leaving, they simply walked through it, passing through solid wood and metal like they were made of mist. On the exterior camera, there was no sign of them. They had not exited the building. They had been absorbed by it. "Where are they now?" I whispered, though I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. "They exist in the spaces between spaces," Principal Morrison replied. "In the walls, in the foundation, in the memory of what this place used to be. We have learned to recognize the signs when the building is becoming active. The lockdown drill was not a drill at all. It was a containment protocol." Chairman Fitzgerald turned off the projector and faced me directly. "This is why board positions rarely change hands in Cedar Falls. This is why certain decisions are made by people who understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. The school serves the community, but it also serves as a prison for something that cannot be allowed to spread. You have been covering up child disappearances for decades," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have been protecting hundreds of other children," Dr. Chen corrected. "Every child who attends this school, every family in this county. The alternative is to close the building, to let whatever exists here escape into the broader world." They showed me more footage from previous years. 1998, when 2 children vanished during a fire drill. 2003, when 1 child disappeared during a severe thunderstorm. 2009, when the building claimed 3 more during a routine maintenance day. Always children who were already vulnerable, already isolated, already partially forgotten by their families and communities. "The building chooses carefully," Principal Morrison explained. "Children whose absence will create the least disruption, whose memories can be quietly erased from official records and community consciousness." "But their families remember," I protested, thinking of Mrs. Chen's confused grief. "Families remember something," Chairman Fitzgerald agreed. But memories fade when they are not reinforced by external evidence. Pictures blur, records disappear, and eventually people convince themselves they were mistaken about what they lost. I left the school that night knowing that I faced an impossible choice. I could expose what I had learned and watch our community torn apart by investigations and media attention, while potentially releasing something far worse into the world. Or I could become complicit in a cover-up that had already claimed dozens of children over several decades. The decision was made for me 3 days later when I found a manila envelope on my front porch. Inside were professional photographs of my own grandchildren, taken recently at locations throughout Cedar Falls. Attached was a simple note. "Some secrets protect more than they harm. Welcome to the board." I have been keeping those secrets for 8 months now. I attend meetings where we discuss budget allocations and maintenance schedules, while carefully monitoring security footage for signs of the building's awakening. I help identify children who fit the profile of potential targets. And I participate in the quiet alterations of records and memories that follow each disappearance. Last month, we lost 2 more children during what the community believes was a routine safety inspection. Their families are already beginning to forget, their photographs already beginning to blur, their enrollment records already being quietly modified. And I sit in those board meetings, taking notes and asking the right questions, while 3 more empty desks wait in classrooms that will never acknowledge the children who once sat in them. Because in Cedar Falls, some kinds of education require sacrifices that can never be discussed in official minutes or annual reports. The building is stirring again. I can feel it in the way the hallways echo differently, in the way shadows move independently of their sources. Soon there will be another drill, another containment protocol, another careful selection of children whose absence will disturb the community the least. And I will be there, taking minutes and maintaining records. Because someone has to document the price we pay to keep the rest of our children safe from what lurks in the spaces between memory and forgetting. Every small town has that one place that stays open all night. And in Willow Creek, that was Mel's Diner. I worked the graveyard shift there for 8 months, and I thought I had seen everything the darkness could bring through those glass doors. Drunks stumbling home from the bar across the street, truckers needing coffee and conversation, insomniacs seeking refuge from their own thoughts. But there was one customer who changed everything I believed about life, death, and the thin line that separates the two. Her name was Hazel Morrison, and she had been dead for 38 years. George Patterson is my name, and I took that job at Mel's because I needed something to pay the bills while I figured out what to do with my life. 29 years old, fresh out of a relationship that had lasted too long, and tired of pretending I had my future mapped out like everyone else my age seemed to. The overnight shift at a diner in a town of 1,500 people was not glamorous, but it was honest work that left me alone with my thoughts and a steady stream of coffee. Willow Creek sits in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, surrounded by wheat fields that stretch to every horizon. The kind of place where 3 generations of the same family live within walking distance of each other, where everyone knows your business before you do, and where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football games on Friday nights. Mel's Diner had been serving the community since 1962, occupying a converted train car on the edge of downtown, with red vinyl booths and a counter that had absorbed decades of conversations and confessions. The overnight shift was typically quiet. Between midnight and 6 in the morning, I might serve a dozen customers on a busy night. Mostly regulars who worked unconventional schedules or dealt with sleep troubles. I learned their names, their orders, and their stories. Coffee black for Jim Harrison, who drove the mail truck. Pie and ice cream for Mrs. Rodriguez, who cleaned offices downtown and always stopped by around 4. Eggs over easy for Danny Walsh, who worked maintenance at the grain elevator and got off work at 3. But Hazel Morrison was different from the first night I saw her. She came in at exactly 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. I noticed the precise timing because the old clock above the register had been running 7 minutes fast for months. And she entered just as it showed 3:24. She was elderly, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a blue dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade. "Coffee, please," she said, settling into the corner booth by the window. Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that suggested she had grown up in this part of Kansas, but had lived elsewhere for a while. I brought her coffee in one of the heavy white mugs we used for regular customers. "Anything else?" "Pie is fresh today. Apple pie if you have it," she replied. "And vanilla ice cream?" I served her the pie and went back to my prep work for the morning shift. When I glanced over a few minutes later, she was sitting with her hands folded, looking out the window at the empty main street. The coffee cup was still full, and the pie remained untouched. She sat there for exactly 43 minutes, never drinking the coffee or eating the pie. At 4 o'clock sharp, she stood up, left exact change on the table including a 20% tip, and walked out into the night. I watched through the window as she crossed the street and disappeared into the shadows between buildings. The next week, Tuesday night at 3:17, she returned. Same blue dress, same order, same behavior. Coffee and apple pie with vanilla ice cream, paid for but never consumed. She would sit in the corner booth for 43 minutes, staring out the window with an expression I could not read, then leave exactly at 4. After her 4th visit, I started paying closer attention. Hazel Morrison looked exactly the same each time. Not just similar clothing, but identical. The same dress with the same small wrinkle near the left shoulder. The same hairstyle with the same few strands that had escaped the bun. Even the same faint lipstick that had been applied with the same slight imperfection on the lower lip. "Do you know Hazel Morrison?" I asked Mel during one of our shift changes. He had owned the diner for 30 years and knew everyone in town. Mel paused while wiping down the counter. "Hazel Morrison died in 1987, George. Car accident out on Highway 36. Why do you ask?" "Someone with that name has been coming in during my shift. Elderly woman, blue dress, orders coffee and pie but never eats." Mel's expression grew serious. "What does she look like?" I described her in detail, including the specific way her hair was styled and the shade of blue in her dress. As I talked, Mel's face grew pale. "That is exactly what she looked like," he whispered. "But George, Hazel Morrison has been dead for 38 years. He disappeared into the back office and returned with a cardboard box filled with old photographs and newspaper clippings. Most were pictures from community events and local celebrations that had been held at the diner over the decades. Near the bottom of the box, he found what he was looking for. The newspaper clipping was from October 1987. The headline read, "Local woman dies in late night accident." Below it was a photograph of Hazel Morrison, age 73, wearing the same blue dress I had seen her in every Tuesday night. The article explained that she had been driving home from a church meeting when her car skidded on wet leaves and struck a tree. She had died instantly at 3:17 in the morning. "She used to come in here every Tuesday night," Mel explained, his voice shaky. "Same time, same order. Coffee and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. But she was trying to lose weight, so she would order it, then just sit with it, using the smell and the company to satisfy her craving without actually eating. According to the article, Hazel had been on her way home from the diner when the accident occurred. She had left at exactly 4 o'clock, just like she had been doing during my shifts. The accident happened less than a mile from Mel's at the intersection of Main Street and Highway 36. "Why is she still coming here?" I asked. Mel shook his head. "I do not know. But if it is really her, there must be a reason she cannot move on." The next Tuesday, I was ready. When Hazel Morrison entered at 317, I watched her every movement more carefully than before. She walked with purpose, but also with a strange lightness, as if her feet barely touched the floor. When she sat down, the vinyl booth did not creak the way it did for other customers. When I brought her coffee, the mug felt strangely cold despite having just come from the pot that was kept at 180 degrees. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, sitting across from her in the booth, "can I ask you something?" She looked at me with eyes that were kind but distant, like she was seeing me from a great distance. "Of course, dear." "Why do you keep coming back here?" For the first time in all her visits, her expression changed. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by what looked like fear. "I am not sure," she admitted. "I remember being here, enjoying the coffee and the pie. But I also remember being very tired, wanting to go home. I got in my car and then..." She paused, touching her forehead like she was trying to recall a difficult memory. "I cannot remember what happened next." "Mrs. Morrison," I said gently, "you died 38 years ago. You were in a car accident after leaving this diner." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see recognition dawning in her eyes. "The tree," she whispered. "I remember the tree, and the rain, and the pain." Her hand moved to her chest. "But if I died, why am I still here?" That question haunted me for the rest of the night. After she left at 4 o'clock, I drove out to the intersection where her accident had occurred. The tree was still there, a massive oak that had been scarred by the impact, but had survived. Plastic flowers and a small cross marked the spot where Hazel Morrison had died. I started researching her life, trying to understand what might be keeping her spirit anchored to that Tuesday night routine. Through old phone books and county records, I learned that she had lived alone in a small house on Elm Street. Never married, no children, but deeply involved in her church and various community organizations. By all accounts, she had been a kind and generous person who was beloved by everyone who knew her. But there was something else I discovered that changed everything. In the weeks before her death, Hazel Morrison had been investigating irregularities in the church's finances. As the treasurer, she had noticed money disappearing from various accounts and had been quietly gathering evidence of embezzlement by other church officials. The night she died, she had not been coming from a regular church meeting. She had been meeting secretly with a lawyer from the county seat, providing him with documents that would have exposed a scheme that had stolen thousands of dollars from church members and local charities. Those documents were never found after her accident. The embezzlement continued for several more years until the scheme collapsed on its own. But by then, the evidence was gone, and no one was ever prosecuted. I realized that Hazel Morrison was trapped in the last night of her life because she had died with unfinished business. She had been carrying the weight of truth that needed to be revealed, and her death had prevented justice from being served. The next Tuesday, when she arrived at 317, I was waiting with a folder full of everything I had learned about her investigation and the embezzlement scheme. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, placing the folder on the table. I think I know why you are still here. I explained what I had discovered about her final mission and how her death had allowed criminals to escape justice. As I talked, her expression grew clearer and more focused, as if she was remembering not just who she was, but why her work had been so important. They stole from the church, she said, her voice growing stronger. From the food bank, from the scholarship fund, from families who trusted us with their donations. The statute of limitations has passed, I told her. But there are still people in town who were harmed by what happened. If you can remember where you hid the evidence, maybe we can find a way to make things right. Hazel smiled for the first time since I had been serving her. The safe deposit box, she whispered. Bank of Willow Creek, box number 207. She reached into her purse, a movement that looked more real and solid than any other gesture I had seen her make. She pulled out a small brass key and placed it on the table. Give this to Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church, she said. He was not involved in the scheme. He can make sure the truth comes out, even now. As soon as she released the key, I could see her beginning to fade. Not disappearing, but becoming lighter, more transparent, like morning fog touched by sunlight. Thank you, she whispered. And for the first time since I had been serving her, she picked up the coffee cup and took a sip. That is perfect coffee, dear. Just the way I remember. She faded away completely at 4 o'clock, leaving behind only the key, exact change for her order, and the lingering scent of apple pie and vanilla ice cream. I delivered the key to Pastor Williams the next morning, along with everything I'd learned about Hazel Morrison's investigation. The safe deposit box contained decades of financial documents that exposed not just the original embezzlement, but ongoing fraud that had continued long after her death. While criminal charges were no longer possible, the revelations led to civil lawsuits that recovered hundreds of thousands of dollars for victims and their families. Scholarships were established in Hazel Morrison's name, and a memorial garden was planted at the church she had died trying to protect. I never saw her again after that Tuesday night. But sometimes, when I am working the overnight shift and the clock shows 3:17, I catch the faint scent of apple pie and vanilla ice cream drifting through the diner. And I know that somewhere, Hazel Morrison is finally at peace in Liette. They called me to settle a property dispute between two families who had been neighbors for 40 years, and I thought it would be a straightforward surveying job. Richard Blackwood is my name, and I've been measuring and mapping land boundaries across North Carolina for 15 years. Most property disputes involve a few feet here and there, maybe a fence that was built in the wrong place or a driveway that crosses into someone else's deed. But what I discovered in the hills outside Harmony Ridge changed everything I thought I knew about the secrets that can be buried beneath seemingly ordinary land. Harmony Ridge is one of those mountain communities that feels removed from the modern world, where families trace their roots back 6 or 7 generations, and newcomers are still considered outsiders after 20 years. The town proper has maybe 200 people, but the surrounding hills are dotted with isolated homesteads and family compounds that have been passed down through generations. It is the kind of place where people handle their own problems and view outside interference with deep suspicion. The Morrison and Fleming families had been feuding over a strip of land that separated their properties for as long as anyone could remember. According to the county clerk who hired me, the dispute had been going on since the early 1980s, with both families claiming ownership of a wedge-shaped piece of forest that covered about 3 acres. Previous surveys had been inconclusive, and the families had been taking turns filing lawsuits that went nowhere. We need a definitive boundary established, the clerk explained when she called me. The families are threatening violence over this thing, and we cannot have that in our county. I drove up to Harmony Ridge on a crisp October morning, my equipment loaded in the back of my truck and a folder full of deeds and historical maps on the passenger seat. The disputed land sat between two similar properties, both featuring older farmhouses with extensive outbuildings and cleared fields that had been carved from the surrounding forest decades ago. Dale Morrison met me at his front gate, a weathered man in his 60s with the kind of deep suspicion of outsiders that I had encountered in other mountain communities. "You the surveyor?" he asked without preamble. "Richard Blackwood," I introduced myself, extending my hand. "I understand you and your neighbors need some boundaries clarified." Morrison shook my hand grudgingly. "Been our land for 40 years, he said. "My daddy cleared that timber himself, and them Flemings got no right to it." The Fleming property was accessible by a dirt road that wound through thick forest before opening into their main compound. Jacob Fleming was younger than Morrison, maybe in his 50s, but he had the same hardened look of someone who had spent his life working the land. "Appreciate you coming out," Fleming said when I introduced myself. "That strip of land has been in our family since my grandfather's time. Morrisons are trying to steal what belongs to us." Both men insisted on being present when I conducted my survey, which made for a tense atmosphere as I set up my equipment. The disputed land was heavily forested, with thick undergrowth that made it difficult to move around with my instruments. But as I worked, I began to notice things that seemed unusual for a natural forest. The trees were all roughly the same age, suggesting the entire area had been cleared and replanted at some point. But more oddly, they seemed to be arranged in subtle patterns, with large gaps that formed rough geometric shapes when viewed from above. My electronic distance measuring device also detected irregularities in the ground that suggested extensive digging had been done at some point. "Has this land been used for farming?" I asked Morrison as I adjusted my theodolite. "Not since I've been here," he replied. "Been woods long as I can remember." Fleming gave a similar response, but both men seemed nervous whenever I asked about the history of the land. They kept glancing at each other across the disputed boundary, and I got the impression they were communicating something that I was not meant to understand. On my second day of surveying, my ground-penetrating radar began picking up anomalies throughout the disputed area. The equipment was designed to detect underground utilities and foundation remains, but what I was seeing looked more extensive and more irregular than anything related to construction or agriculture. "There are significant underground disturbances throughout this area," I told both families when they met me at the site that afternoon. "Before I can establish definitive boundaries, I need to understand what I am dealing with down there." Morrison and Fleming exchanged a look that I could not interpret. "What kind of disturbances?" Fleming asked. "Large excavations that have been backfilled," I explained. "Multiple sites, some quite deep. If there are septic systems or old foundations down there, they could affect property values and development rights." That evening at my motel in town, I spent hours studying the radar images on my laptop. What I was seeing was unlike anything in my 15 years of surveying. The underground disturbances were extensive and appeared to follow patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random digging. More disturbing were the shapes themselves. Long, narrow excavations arranged in rough grids, each approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. As a professional surveyor, I had seen enough cemetery layouts to recognize what I was looking at. I was looking at graves, dozens of them, scattered throughout the 3-acre disputed area. The next morning, I called the county sheriff's office and requested that a deputy meet me at the site. If there were unmarked graves on the property, it became a legal matter that went far beyond a simple boundary dispute. Deputy Williams arrived within an hour, and I showed him the radar images. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. "Those look like burial sites," he agreed. "But there is no cemetery recorded in this area. Are you sure your equipment is working correctly?" I ran the scans again, and the results were consistent. 43 separate anomalies, all the right size and shape to be individual graves, scattered throughout the disputed land in a pattern that suggested they had been dug over an extended period of time. "We need to notify the families," Deputy Williams said, "and probably the State Archaeological Office. If these are Native American graves or historical burials, there are procedures we have to follow." But when we approached Morrison and Fleming with our findings, their reactions were not what I expected. Instead of surprise or concern, both men went pale and began speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "You cannot bring outsiders here," Morrison said. "This is family business." Fleming nodded in agreement. "Some things are better left buried." Deputy Williams pressed them for more information, but both families became increasingly evasive. They claimed they had no knowledge of any graves on the property and insisted that my equipment must be malfunctioning. That night, I received a phone call at my motel. The voice was male but disguised, speaking in a whisper that made it impossible to identify. "Stop digging," the voice said. "Leave Harmony Ridge tomorrow and never come back. This is your only warning." I hung up and immediately called Deputy Williams. He promised to increase patrols around my motel and the surveying site, but I could tell he was taking the threat seriously. The next day, I returned to the disputed land with a different approach. Instead of focusing on boundary lines, I concentrated on documenting the underground anomalies. If these were illegal burial sites, I needed evidence that would hold up in court. As I worked, I noticed that both families were watching me from a distance. Morrison stood at the edge of his property with what looked like a rifle, while Fleming paced back and forth along his fence line. The tension was palpable, and I began to understand that I had stumbled into something far more serious than a property dispute. My breakthrough came when I decided to dig a small test hole at one of the radar anomaly sites. I had brought a folding shovel for exactly this purpose, and I chose a location that was roughly in the center of the disputed area. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something that was definitely not soil or rock. I cleared away more dirt and exposed what was unmistakably human bone. A skull, partially preserved and stained dark brown from decades in the earth. But this was not an old burial. There were metal fragments mixed with the remains, pieces of what looked like contemporary clothing and personal effects. I could see a wristwatch, tarnished jewelry, and scraps of fabric that had not fully decomposed. I was looking at a murder victim, not an ancestor. I immediately called Deputy Williams and began photographing everything before disturbing the site further. But as I worked, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the forest. Morrison and Fleming had approached silently, and they were now standing about 20 feet away, watching me document their secret. Both men were armed, and their expressions made it clear that they viewed me as a threat to something much more important than property boundaries. "You should not have dug there," Morrison said quietly. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, still crouched beside the exposed grave. Fleming answered, 40 years, give or take, maybe a few more. People pass through these mountains, drifters and travelers who nobody misses. Sometimes they cause problems, threaten families, steal from decent folks. "So you kill them," I said. "So we protect what is ours," Morrison corrected. and we dispose of problems in a way that keeps our community safe. I realized that the property dispute had been a cover story for decades. The two families were not fighting over the land. They were cooperating to maintain it as a private burial ground for victims they could not afford to have discovered. "The surveying stops now," Fleming said, raising his rifle. "And you forget what you found here." Deputy Williams arrived 15 minutes later to find my equipment abandoned, but no sign of me. The test hole had been hastily filled, and both families claimed they had no idea where I had gone. It took search teams 3 days to find my body in a ravine 2 miles from the disputed property. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental fall while surveying remote terrain, despite the obvious evidence of violence. But I am still here in a way, still measuring and mapping the secrets buried in the hills around Harmony Ridge. And I know that someday, someone else will discover what the Morrison and Fleming families have been hiding in the land they never really fought over. The 44 graves are still there, waiting to tell their stories to anyone brave enough to dig deep enough to find the truth. I was supposed to fill in for the regular nurse in Riverside for just 2 weeks while she recovered from surgery. But what I discovered in that small Iowa town kept me awake for months after I finally escaped. Betty Sullivan is my name, and I have been a visiting nurse for 12 years, covering rural communities across the Midwest where medical professionals are scarce and help is always needed. I thought I had seen every kind of medical situation possible in isolated places. But Riverside taught me that some communities will go to unimaginable lengths to preserve what they consider their way of life. Riverside sits along a bend in the Cedar River, population 637, according to the faded welcome sign at the edge of town. The kind of place where cornfields stretch in every direction, where the biggest building is the grain elevator, and where 3 generations of families live within a few blocks of each other. It should have been a routine assignment. Cover the basic medical needs of a small community for 2 weeks, help with medication management for elderly residents, and assist the local doctor with whatever cases came up. Dr. Arthur Coleman had been Riverside's only physician for over 30 years, and everyone spoke of him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints. He had delivered most of the younger generation, treated everything from farming accidents to heart attacks, and never turned away a patient, regardless of their ability to pay. When I arrived at his clinic on a Monday morning in September, he greeted me with the warm professionalism I had come to expect from small-town doctors. "Welcome to Riverside, Betty," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm despite his 70-plus years. "Martha Wilson will be back in 2 weeks, but until then, I am grateful for the help." The clinic was small but well-equipped, occupying a converted house on Main Street with examination rooms that had been added over the years as the practice grew. Dr. Coleman showed me around, introduced me to the receptionist and the part-time lab technician, and explained the filing system for patient records. "Most of our patients are families who have been coming here for decades," he explained as we walked through the facility. "You will find that Riverside folks are remarkably healthy for a rural community. We have very low rates of cancer, heart disease, and other chronic conditions that plague similar towns." That first week seemed to confirm his assessment. I saw patients for routine blood pressure checks, diabetes monitoring, and minor injuries. Everyone was friendly and seemed genuinely healthy for their age groups. But I began to notice patterns in the medical records that struck me as unusual. Every family in town seemed to share certain genetic traits that should have been much more rare. Unusual eye colors, distinctive facial structures, and physical characteristics that appeared with remarkable frequency across supposedly unrelated family lines. More concerning were the laboratory results I reviewed while organizing patient files. Blood work from residents showed genetic markers that I had never seen clustered together in such high concentrations. Not necessarily abnormal results, but unusual patterns that suggested these people shared far more genetic material than would be typical for a general population, even in an isolated rural community. Dr. Coleman, I asked during one of our consultations, have there been genetic studies done on the population here? Some of these lab results show interesting patterns. His reaction was immediate and defensive. Betty, I think you are reading too much into routine blood work. Small communities naturally develop certain shared characteristics over generations. But my nursing background included genetics training, and what I was seeing went far beyond normal population genetics. These people were not just distantly related through common ancestors. They were showing markers consistent with much closer genetic relationships than anyone was acknowledging. My suspicions deepened when I began reviewing the obstetric records from the past several decades. Dr. Coleman had delivered hundreds of babies over his career, but the birth records showed patterns that made no medical sense. Pregnancy complications that should have occurred regularly in any population were completely absent. Genetic disorders that should have appeared at predictable rates simply did not exist in Riverside. Either this community had the most extraordinary genetic luck in medical history, or something else was happening that was not reflected in the official records. I need to ask you about the fertility treatments, I said to Dr. Coleman at the end of my first week. He paused in his chart review. What fertility treatments? The medication inventory shows regular orders for reproductive hormones and genetic screening supplies that would typically be used for fertility interventions. But I do not see any corresponding patient records for these treatments. Dr. Coleman closed the chart he had been reviewing and looked at me with an expression that had shifted from friendly to calculating. Betty, you are a temporary employee here. Your job is to assist with routine patient care, not to audit medical practices. That evening, I drove through Riverside's residential neighborhoods, paying closer attention to the families I had been treating. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. Children who supposedly belonged to different families showed striking physical similarities. Siblings who should have been years apart in age looked like twins, and adults who claimed no family relationship could have been identical relatives. The next morning, I arrived at the clinic early and used my access to the medical records to conduct a more thorough review. What I discovered made me physically ill. Dr. Coleman had not been practicing conventional medicine for decades. He had been conducting genetic experiments on the entire population of Riverside, using fertility treatments and selective breeding to create what amounted to a controlled human breeding program. The medical files contained detailed genetic analyses of every resident, tracking bloodlines and genetic markers with the precision of a livestock breeding operation. Families that claimed to be unrelated were actually carefully selected genetic matches. Pregnancies were not natural occurrences, but planned genetic combinations designed to reinforce desired traits. More horrifying were the records of unsuccessful outcomes. Children who did not meet genetic criteria were listed as stillbirths or infant deaths, but follow-up documentation suggested they had been removed from families and relocated elsewhere. The numbers were staggering. Over 30 years, hundreds of children had been born in Riverside, but only those who met Dr. Coleman's genetic standards had been allowed to remain. You should not have access to those files, Dr. Coleman said from behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway of the records room, and for the first time since I had arrived in Riverside, he did not look like a kindly small-town doctor. He looked like a man who had been caught in the middle of something unforgivable. "What have you done to these people?" I whispered. "I have created perfection," he replied calmly. "Riverside represents the future of human evolution. 3 generations of carefully controlled genetic selection, eliminating hereditary diseases and enhancing desirable traits. These people are healthier, more intelligent, and more physically capable than any normal population. They are your experiments, I said. You have been treating an entire town like laboratory animals. Dr. Coleman smiled. And now you understand why you are really here, Betty. Martha Wilson did not have surgery. She began asking the same questions you are asking, and she had to be removed from the situation. I realized with growing horror that my assignment to Riverside had not been random. I had been selected, evaluated, and brought here for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with providing medical care. You need new genetic material, I said. The breeding program is starting to show signs of inbreeding, and you need outside DNA to continue. You have excellent genetics, Betty. Healthy family history, high intelligence, and no chronic medical conditions. You would make valuable contributions to our community. I backed toward the clinic's rear exit, but Dr. Coleman moved to block my path. The people of Riverside have been very patient with your investigation, but now it is time for you to accept your role here. Through the window, I could see residents gathering in the street outside the clinic. Men, women, and children who I had been treating for the past week, all watching the building with expressions that were no longer friendly and welcoming. They knew what was happening inside, and they were there to ensure I did not leave. How long has this been going on? I asked, stalling while I looked for another exit. Since I arrived here in 1993, Dr. Coleman replied. Riverside was dying then, losing population and economic opportunities. I offered them a chance to become something special, something better than human. They embraced the vision. You mean they embraced the delusion? I corrected. These people are not evolved. They are victims of medical abuse on a scale that should be impossible in modern America. Dr. Coleman's expression hardened. They are the future, Betty. And you are going to help ensure that future continues. I broke the window behind me with a paperweight from the desk, climbed through, cutting my arms on the glass, but escaping into the alley behind the clinic. I could hear shouting from inside the building and the sound of people running toward my location. I made it to my car and drove out of Riverside faster than I had ever driven in my life, not stopping until I reached the state police barracks 50 miles away. But when the investigators arrived in Riverside the next day, they found a normal small town with a respected doctor who claimed he had never heard of Betty Sullivan. The medical records I had seen were gone. The genetic testing equipment had vanished. Even the blood samples that had shown unusual markers had been replaced with normal results. Dr. Coleman presented documentation showing that no visiting nurse had been assigned to his clinic, and the residents of Riverside supported his statements completely. The investigation was closed within a week due to lack of evidence. But I know what I saw in those files. I know what Dr. Coleman was doing to the people of Riverside, and I know that somewhere in Iowa, a genetic experiment is continuing under the guise of small-town medical care. The perfect community that never gets sick, never shows genetic disorders, and never questions why their doctor has been controlling their lives for over 30 years. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder about other small towns with beloved doctors and unusually healthy populations. I wonder how many rural communities have embraced similar visions of genetic perfection, and how many visitors like me have disappeared into experiments that continue in the shadows of American medicine. I came to Copper Hill to film their annual Harvest Festival, thinking it would be a charming, small-town tradition documentary that could help launch my independent filmmaking career. Arthur Phillips is my name, and I had spent 2 years researching unique American festivals when I discovered references to Copper Hill's 3-day celebration in obscure folklore journals. The descriptions made it sound like a perfect subject. An isolated Texas community that had maintained pre-industrial harvest traditions for over a century. I had no idea I was documenting the final phase of a ritual that had been consuming visitors for generations. Copper Hill sits in the East Texas piney woods, population 412, accessible only by a single winding road that branches off from a state highway and disappears into dense forest. The kind of place that exists on maps but feels forgotten by the modern world, where the cell phone service is spotty and the nearest interstate is 2 hours away. Perfect for a documentary about authentic American traditions that have survived in isolation. I arrived on a Thursday in late October, 2 days before the Harvest Festival was scheduled to begin. The town seemed frozen in time, with wooden storefronts that could have been built 50 years ago, and residents who moved with the unhurried pace of people who have never been in a rush to get anywhere. Everyone I met was friendly but guarded, willing to talk about the weather and local history, but evasive when I asked specific questions about the festival. "You will understand everything once it begins," Mayor Patricia Hendricks told me when I interviewed her at the town hall. Copper Hill's Harvest Festival is not like other celebrations. It is something that has to be experienced to be appreciated. I set up my equipment at the Copper Hill Inn, a converted Victorian house that served as the town's only lodging. The proprietor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Coleman, seemed nervous about having a filmmaker in town during festival weekend. "Most visitors who come for the festival do not need accommodations," she explained while showing me to my room. "They usually become part of the community by the end of the 3 days." I assumed she meant that people enjoyed the festival so much they extended their stays or decided to move to Copper Hill. Small towns are always hoping to attract new residents, and a successful festival could be good for local economic development. The first day of the Harvest Festival began at dawn on Saturday, with what the residents called the Awakening Ceremony. The entire town gathered in the central square, forming concentric circles around a raised platform where Mayor Hendricks and several other community leaders stood wearing elaborate costumes that looked handmade and ancient. I filmed everything, focusing on the intricate details of the costumes and the solemn expressions of the participants. The ceremony involved chanting in what sounded like a mixture of languages, some recognizable as variants of English and Spanish, but others completely unfamiliar. The townspeople moved in synchronized patterns, stepping in rhythm to drums that were played by children who could not have been more than 10 years old. "This represents the awakening of the harvest spirit," explained James Morrison, a local teacher who had volunteered to be my guide. "Our ancestors brought these traditions from the old country, and we have maintained them without interruption for over 100 years. But as I filmed, I began to notice details that did not match Morrison's explanation. The costumes were not folk designs from any European tradition I could identify. The symbols carved into the wooden platform were not Celtic or Germanic, but something much older and more primitive. And the chanting, when I listened carefully through my headphones, contained words that sounded more like incantations than traditional folk songs. The second day involved what the residents called the binding ceremony. This time, the townspeople constructed elaborate displays throughout the business district, using corn stalks, pumpkins, and other harvest decorations to create intricate patterns that were visible from the second-story windows of the inn. From my elevated vantage point with my camera, I could see that the decorations were not random arrangements. They formed a complex geometric design that encompassed the entire downtown area, with the town square at the center and radiating patterns that extended to the edges of the commercial district. Each family contributes specific elements to the overall design. Morrison explained as we walked through the decorated streets. The pattern has been refined over generations, with each year adding new components while maintaining the essential structure. But the pattern I was documenting looked less like harvest decorations and more like some kind of containment circle, with symbols and arrangements that seemed designed to trap or control something rather than celebrate it. The geometric precision was far too exact for folk art, suggesting knowledge of mathematical principles that seemed out of place in a rural Texas community. On the second evening, I was invited to join the townspeople for what they called the Feast of Preparation. Long tables had been set up in the town square, loaded with food that had been prepared by various families throughout the day. Everyone in Copper Hill was present, from newborn babies to elderly residents who could barely walk. The food was unlike anything I had ever tasted. Rich, complex flavors that seemed familiar but impossible to identify. When I asked about the recipes, people would smile and give vague answers about family traditions and secret ingredients that had been passed down for generations. "You are eating the essence of Copper Hill," Mayor Hendricks told me as she refilled my plate. "Food that connects you to our community and our history." As the evening progressed, I began to feel strange. Not sick exactly, but altered in a way I could not describe. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds were more intense, and I felt a growing sense of connection to the people around me. Other visitors to the festival were experiencing similar effects, laughing and talking with residents as if they had known each other for years. "The food helps newcomers understand what Copper Hill is really about," Morrison explained when I asked about the unusual sensations. "It opens the mind to possibilities that might otherwise be rejected." That night, I reviewed the footage I had shot during the first 2 days of the festival. What I saw disturbed me more than I could rationally explain. When I watched the ceremonies through my camera, the participants looked different than they had appeared to my naked eye. Their movements were more mechanical, their expressions were blank and distant, and their costumes seemed to be made of materials that shifted and changed texture as I watched. More disturbing were the visitors like myself. In the footage, we appeared to be in various states of transformation, our faces becoming more similar to the residents and our movements becoming more synchronized with the group activities. I looked at my own reflection in the inn's mirror and saw subtle changes in my features that had not been there when I arrived. The third day was called the Harvest of Souls, and I woke up knowing that I needed to leave Copper Hill immediately. Whatever was happening during the festival was not a cultural tradition, but something far more sinister and supernatural. But when I tried to pack my equipment and check out of the inn, Mrs. Coleman informed me that leaving was not possible until the festival concluded. "The roads are closed during the final ceremony," she explained with a smile that no longer looked friendly. "Everyone who participates in the Harvest Festival must see it through to completion." I discovered that my car keys were missing from my room, and my cell phone had stopped working entirely. The other visitors who had arrived for the festival seemed unconcerned about these developments, apparently accepting that they would remain in Copper Hill for as long as necessary. The final ceremony began at sunset in the town square, with all the residents and visitors forming a massive circle around the decorated platform. Mayor Hendricks began chanting in the unknown language I had heard during the previous ceremonies, and the entire crowd responded in unison with words I somehow knew, despite never having heard them before. As the chanting continued, I began to understand what was really happening in Copper Hill. The Harvest Festival was not celebrating the agricultural harvest, but harvesting something else entirely: the identities, memories, and souls of visitors who were drawn to the community. The geometric patterns created with harvest decorations were not folk art, but a massive ritual circle designed to trap and transform anyone who participated in the 3-day ceremony. The food served during the feast of preparation contained substances that made visitors susceptible to the transformation process. And the final ceremony was designed to complete the harvest by absorbing newcomers into the collective consciousness of Copper Hill. I could feel my individual identity dissolving as the chanting reached a crescendo. My memories of life outside Copper Hill were fading, replaced by a sense of belonging to something ancient and hungry. The other visitors around me were undergoing the same transformation, their faces taking on the blank expressions I had seen in my camera footage. But some part of me, the part that had spent years behind a camera lens documenting reality, remained separate from the collective experience. While my body participated in the ritual, my consciousness retreated to a space where I could observe what was happening without being completely consumed by it. I watched as the festival concluded with all the visitors fully transformed into residents of Copper Hill, ready to help prepare for next year's celebration and the new harvest of souls it would bring. I saw myself smiling and shaking hands with Mayor Hendricks, accepting my permanent role in the community, while some deeper part of my mind screamed in helpless horror. The documentary I had intended to create was never completed, but the footage still exists somewhere in the collective memory of Copper Hill. Every year, during the Harvest Festival, that part of me that remains separate watches new filmmakers and researchers and curious visitors arrive in town, drawn by the same obscure references that had brought me here. And every year, I participate in their transformation while desperately hoping that one of them will prove strong enough to escape with the truth about what really happens when small towns maintain traditions that are older and hungrier than anyone wants to believe. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true Appalachian Trail horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about America's oldest and most isolated mountain wilderness. These are not campfire tales or urban legends, but documented accounts from hikers who encountered the unexplainable on one of the most challenging and remote trails in the world. Each story has been meticulously researched through first-hand testimonies, cross-referenced with official reports, and verified through trail registers and Park Service records. From unexplained disappearances and encounters with forces beyond comprehension to psychological terror that defies rational explanation. These accounts represent the darkest experiences shared by those who walk the 2,190-mile corridor through ancient forests, where civilization barely reaches. The Appalachian Trail holds mysteries that most hikers will never speak about. And after tonight, you will understand why. If you are drawn to genuine horror content rooted in real experiences that will challenge your sense of safety in the wilderness, subscribe to Buried Files and enable the notification bell so you never miss our deep investigations into cases that authorities cannot explain. After you hear these 7 chilling testimonies, we encourage you to share your own unexplained wilderness encounters in the comments below, as your story might be featured in our next episode. Now settle in, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself as we descend into the terrifying reality of what truly lurks along the Appalachian Trail. Walter Jennings was not the kind of man who did things on a whim. At 42 years old, he had spent the better part of 2 decades working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in suburban Pennsylvania, where predictability and order were not just preferred, but required. His life had fallen into a comfortable rhythm of spreadsheets, tax codes, and weekend hikes on well-marked trails near his home. He was methodical, cautious, and always prepared. So when he announced to his wife Margaret that he was going to attempt his first solo section hike on the Appalachian Trail, she was surprised but not concerned. Walter had been planning it for months, researching every mile of the Georgia section he intended to cover. studying trail maps until he could recite shelter names and water sources from memory. It was late September when Walter drove down to Amicalola Falls State Park in northern Georgia, where the approach trail to the Appalachian Trail begins. The air had started to cool, and the forests were beginning their slow transformation into autumn colors. He checked in at the visitor center, signed the trail register, and spent nearly 20 minutes speaking with a ranger about current trail conditions. The ranger noted that Walter seemed well prepared, carrying a satellite phone, a GPS device, plenty of food, and appropriate gear for the season. He had planned a modest 5-day route that would take him through some of the more scenic sections of the southern Appalachians, ending at Neel's Gap, where Margaret would pick him up. The first 2 days went exactly as Walter had planned. He hiked at a steady pace, stopping frequently to take photographs and make detailed entries in his trail journal. He noted the temperature, the wildlife he encountered, and his own physical condition. On the first night, he stayed at Hawk Mountain Shelter, where he met 2 northbound through hikers who were finishing their journey. They shared stories over freeze-dried meals, and Walter felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what he had been looking for: a chance to test himself, to experience solitude, and to prove that he was still capable of adventure. On the second night, he camped at Gooch Mountain Shelter, and his journal entry from that evening was cheerful and optimistic. He wrote about the stunning views from the ridgeline, the kindness of fellow hikers, and his anticipation for the days ahead. But there was one line at the end of that entry that would later become significant. He wrote that he had felt briefly disoriented on the trail that afternoon, as though he had passed the same distinctive boulder twice, even though his map clearly showed he was making forward progress. He dismissed it as fatigue and noted that he would get a good night of sleep. The third day was when everything changed. Walter was scheduled to reach Blood Mountain Shelter by late afternoon, where he planned to stay for the night. Margaret expected him to check in via satellite phone by 6 in the evening, as he had done the previous 2 nights. When 6 o'clock came and went without a call, she was not immediately worried. Service could be unpredictable, and Walter might have simply decided to push on to the next shelter. But when 7 o'clock passed, then 8, and still no word, Margaret began to feel the first stirrings of real concern. By 9 o'clock, she was on the phone with the Park Service, reporting that her husband had failed to check in. A search and rescue operation was launched the following morning. A team of rangers and volunteers hiked to Blood Mountain Shelter, expecting to find Walter either there or somewhere along the approach trail. What they found instead was deeply unsettling. Walter's backpack was at the shelter, neatly arranged on one of the wooden sleeping platforms. His sleeping bag was rolled and tied with precision. His food bag hung properly from the bear cables. His hiking boots were placed side by side near the pack, as though he had removed them before going to sleep. But Walter himself was nowhere to be found. The search team immediately began canvassing the area, calling his name, checking nearby water sources, and examining the trail in both directions. It was one of the rangers who found Walter's journal, still tucked into a side pocket of his pack. The final entry was dated the morning of the third day, and it was unlike any of his previous entries. The handwriting was shaky, less controlled. He wrote that he had woken before dawn feeling strange, as though he had not slept at all, despite having no memory of lying awake. He described a persistent sensation of being watched, a feeling that had started the moment he opened his eyes and had not diminished even as the sun rose. He wrote that he could not shake the impression that something in the forest was waiting for him, and that he felt compelled to go find it. The rangers found this entry disturbing, but what came next was even more troubling. When they examined Walter's GPS device, which was still in his pack and fully charged, they discovered that the tracking data told an impossible story. According to the device, Walter had spent more than 6 hours the previous afternoon walking in a tight circular pattern, covering the same 200-yard radius again and again. The path formed an almost perfect spiral on the digital map, tightening with each loop until the signal abruptly stopped in the exact center. The timestamp showed that the device had lost signal at 3:27 in the afternoon, right around the time Walter should have been arriving at the shelter. Search dogs were brought in, but their behavior was strange. The animals picked up Walter's scent easily enough and followed it from the shelter down a narrow side trail that led toward a series of rocky outcroppings. But after less than a quarter mile, the dogs stopped abruptly. They began to whine and pull backward, refusing to go any further, despite the urgings of their handlers. One of the dogs became so agitated that it had to be removed from the search entirely. The handlers, all experienced professionals, admitted they had never seen anything quite like it. By the afternoon of the second day of searching, the operation had expanded significantly. A helicopter was brought in to conduct aerial surveys of the surrounding area, and additional volunteers were called in to cover more ground. It was the helicopter crew that finally spotted Walter. He was nearly 4 miles from Blood Mountain Shelter, far off any established trail, walking through dense forest in a perfectly straight line. The crew radioed his position to the ground team, who immediately began moving to intercept him. The ground team struggled through thick undergrowth and steep terrain, racing to reach Walter before he disappeared again. When they finally caught sight of him, he was standing at the edge of a deep ravine, motionless, staring down into the shadowed depths below. One of the rangers called out his name, but Walter did not respond immediately. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then slowly, deliberately, he turned to face them. His expression was blank, his eyes unfocused. When he spoke, his voice was flat and distant. He said, "They are waiting below." And before anyone could react, he took a single step backward and fell off the edge. The fall should have killed him. The ravine dropped nearly 40 feet to a rocky streambed below. But somehow, impossibly, Walter survived. He landed in a way that broke both legs, fractured his pelvis, and caused severe internal injuries. But he remained conscious. The rescue team rappelled down to reach him, and he was airlifted by helicopter to a trauma center in Atlanta. During the flight, he kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "They called me. I had to go to them." Walter spent weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries. Margaret stayed by his side, but she noticed that her husband was not the same man who had left for that hike. He was distant, distracted, and refused to speak about what had happened on the trail. When doctors and authorities questioned him, he claimed to have no memory of the events following his departure from Blood Mountain Shelter. He could not explain why he had left his gear behind, why he had walked in circles, or why he had gone off trail. He had no memory of the helicopter, no memory of standing at the ravine, and no memory of the fall. But Margaret knew he was lying. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he flinched when she mentioned the Appalachian Trail, in the way he stared out the hospital window as though searching for something in the distance. One night, when she pressed him, he finally spoke. He told her that he remembered everything. He remembered waking at the shelter and feeling the pull, an overwhelming compulsion to go into the forest. He remembered walking, not in circles as the GPS suggested, but in a straight line toward something he could not see but could feel with absolute certainty. He remembered voices, not heard with his ears but felt in his chest, calling him deeper and deeper. And he remembered reaching the ravine and looking down to see figures standing in the shadows below. Figures that were waiting for him. figures that he knew he was meant to join. Margaret begged him to speak to a therapist, to get help processing the trauma. Walter agreed to attend 3 sessions, but he refused to continue after that. He would not explain why. When Margaret found the number for the therapist and called to ask what had happened, the woman would only say that Walter had described experiences that she was not equipped to address, and that she had referred him to a colleague who specialized in more unusual cases. Walter never followed up with that referral. Authorities searched the ravine extensively, looking for any clues that might explain Walter's behavior. They found nothing unusual. No signs of other people, no structures, no evidence of drug use or environmental factors that might have caused hallucinations. The GPS data remained unexplained, a digital record of something that should not have been possible. Walter eventually recovered enough to return home, though he walked with a permanent limp and would never regain full mobility. He returned to his job, but his co-workers noticed the change. He was quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped hiking entirely, even refusing to walk on the trails near his home. Margaret tried to be supportive, but the distance between them grew. Walter spent hours staring out the windows, and she often woke in the night to find him standing in the backyard, looking toward the mountains in the distance. 3 years after the incident, Margaret filed for divorce. She told her sister that she could not live with a man who was only half present, a man whose mind was still somewhere out in those woods. Walter did not contest the divorce. He moved into a small apartment and continued working, but he isolated himself almost completely. The few people who remained in contact with him said that he seemed to be waiting for something, though he would never say what. To this day, Walter Jennings has never given a full account of what happened to him on the Appalachian Trail. The official report lists the incident as a case of acute psychological distress brought on by solo hiking and possible dehydration. But those who were involved in the search know that explanation does not fit the facts. The spiral pattern on the GPS, the reaction of the search dogs, and Walter's own words all point to something far stranger. And somewhere in northern Georgia, on a stretch of trail that sees thousands of hikers every year, there is a place where the forest grows quiet, where compasses spin without reason, and where those who listen too carefully might hear something calling from the trees. Clarence Mitchell had earned his trail name honestly. At 55 years old, the retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades following orders and giving them. On the Appalachian Trail, where he had started his northbound through hike in early March, other hikers had quickly dubbed him Sarge, and the name stuck. Clarence did not mind. He had spent his entire adult life in the Corps, and even though he had retired 2 years earlier, the military mindset was not something he could simply switch off. He woke at dawn, maintained his gear with meticulous care, and hiked with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone who understood that consistency mattered more than speed. By late April, Clarence had made it to Virginia, the longest state on the trail and one that tested the patience of even the most determined hikers. The terrain was challenging, but not impossible, and the weather had been cooperating. Spring was arriving in earnest, with wildflowers beginning to bloom and the trees filling in with new leaves. Clarence had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, and for the first time since his retirement, he felt like he had found a sense of purpose again. It was on a warm Thursday afternoon that Clarence stopped at a small stream crossing to filter water and found himself joined by a younger hiker who introduced himself as Eugene, though everyone on the trail called him Tadpole. Eugene was 26, thin and energetic, with the kind of enthusiasm that marked someone still early in their through hike. He had started at Springer Mountain 3 weeks after Clarence and had been pushing longer days to catch up with a group of friends somewhere ahead. The two men struck up an easy conversation while they filled their water bottles, discussing trail conditions, upcoming shelter locations, and the usual complaints about Virginia's endless miles. When Eugene mentioned that he was planning to stop at the partnership shelter about 6 miles ahead, Clarence nodded. He had been planning the same thing. The shelter was located near a Forest Service road and was known for being well maintained, with a reliable water source and plenty of space. It seemed like an ideal place to end the day. They hiked together for the remaining miles, their conversation ranging from trail gossip to Eugene's plans after he finished his hike. Clarence found himself enjoying the company. Solo hiking had its benefits, but it was nice to have someone to talk to occasionally. They arrived at the shelter around 5 in the evening, with plenty of daylight remaining. But as they approached, both men noticed something that immediately changed the atmosphere. The shelter was already occupied by 3 men who were clearly not thru-hikers. They wore camouflage hunting gear, had several coolers stacked near the shelter, and their conversation stopped abruptly when Clarence and Eugene came into view. One of them, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a thick beard, stood up and walked to the edge of the shelter platform. "Shelter's full," the man said flatly. His tone was not friendly, and there was no attempt at the usual trail courtesy. The 2 other men remained seated but watched Clarence and Eugene with obvious suspicion. Clarence immediately assessed the situation with the trained eye of someone who had spent years evaluating potential threats. These men were not hikers. They had no backpacks, no trail gear, and their boots were wrong for long-distance hiking. More importantly, their body language was aggressive and territorial. "We're just looking for a place to stay for the night," Eugene said, trying to sound casual. "Plenty of room in there for everyone." The bearded man shook his head. "I said it's full. You two need to move on." Clarence remained silent, his eyes moving over the scene. Something was very wrong here. It was not hunting season, and even if it were, hunters did not typically use AT shelters as base camps. He noticed that none of the men had hunting licenses displayed, which was required by law. He also noticed a handheld radio clipped to the bearded man's belt, crackling occasionally with static and brief, coded transmissions. "Listen," Clarence said, keeping his voice level and non-confrontational. "We've hiked a long way today. Next shelter is 8 miles north, and it's getting late. We can set up tents down the trail a bit if the shelter's too crowded." The bearded man, who had introduced himself as Dale, seemed to consider this. "Yeah, you do that. Set up somewhere down the trail. Don't need you two hanging around here." Eugene looked at Clarence, clearly wanting to argue. But Clarence gave him a subtle shake of the head. This was not a situation worth escalating. They moved down the trail about 200 yards and found a relatively flat area where they could pitch their tents out of sight of the shelter. Eugene was visibly frustrated as they set up camp. "What is their problem?" Eugene asked in a low voice. "Since when do people just claim a whole shelter like that?" "They're not hikers," Clarence said quietly, his attention focused on setting up his tent with efficient movements. "And I don't think they're hunters either. Something else is going on." As darkness fell, both men prepared their dinners on their camp stoves, speaking in hushed tones. The forest grew quiet except for the usual sounds of insects and the occasional bird call. But around 9 o'clock, they heard the distant sound of a vehicle approaching on the nearby Forest Service road. Clarence immediately held up a hand for silence, and both men listened intently. They heard the vehicle stop, heard doors opening and closing, and then heard voices carrying through the trees. The conversation was too far away to make out specific words, but the tone was businesslike and urgent. Clarence made a decision. "Stay here," he whispered to Eugene. "I'm going to take a look." "Are you crazy?" Eugene hissed back. "Those guys already made it clear they don't want us around." "Which is exactly why I need to see what they're doing," Clarence replied. "Something illegal is happening at that shelter, and I want to know what we're dealing with." Before Eugene could protest further, Clarence moved into the trees, using the low visibility tactics he had learned decades ago in the military. He moved slowly and carefully, testing each footfall before committing his weight, keeping to the shadows. It took him nearly 15 minutes to cover the 200 yards back to the shelter area. But when he finally had a clear line of sight, what he saw confirmed his suspicions. A white pickup truck was parked on the Forest Service road, and the 3 men from the shelter were transferring packages from the truck bed to the shelter area. The packages were wrapped in plastic and tape, uniform in size, and handled with obvious care. Dale was directing the operation while speaking into his radio, and Clarence caught fragments of the conversation. Words like shipment, route, and next drop carried clearly through the night air. This was not a hunting trip. This was a drug operation, and the shelter was being used as a transfer point. Clarence had seen enough. He began backing away slowly, retracing his path through the woods. But in his focus on watching the men, he failed to notice a dead branch directly behind his foot. When his weight came down, the branch snapped with a crack that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Instantly, all activity at the shelter stopped. Dale's head snapped around, and he shouted, "Someone's out there!" Flashlight beams lanced through the darkness, sweeping the tree line. Clarence abandoned stealth and ran, crashing through the underbrush back toward where Eugene was waiting. Behind him, he could hear the men giving chase, their lights bobbing through the trees. He burst into their camping area to find Eugene already stuffing his sleeping bag into his pack with shaking hands. "Run!" Clarence shouted. "North on the trail now." They grabbed their packs, leaving their tents behind, and ran down the trail in near total darkness. The voices behind them were getting closer, and Clarence could hear at least 2, maybe 3 men crashing through the forest in pursuit. His lungs burned and his legs protested, but fear and adrenaline drove him forward. Eugene was younger and faster, but he stayed close, occasionally looking back with wild eyes. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes, their headlamps casting wild shadows on the trail ahead. Clarence's military training kept him focused despite the panic. He knew they needed to get off the obvious path, needed to find somewhere to hide. When they reached a trail intersection with a Blue Blaze side trail, he grabbed Eugene's arm and pulled him off the main path. "Lights off," Clarence commanded, and they both killed their headlamps, plunging into complete darkness. They stumbled down the side trail until Clarence spotted a tumble of large boulders off to the left. "There," he whispered, and they scrambled behind the rocks, pressing themselves into the smallest space possible. They heard their pursuers reach the intersection less than a minute later. The men were breathing hard, and their flashlights swept back and forth across the trail. Clarence and Eugene held absolutely still, barely breathing, as the lights came terrifyingly close to their hiding spot. One of the men walked to within 20 feet of the boulder pile, his light passing just inches from Eugene's boot. Then Clarence heard the sound that made his blood run cold. One of the men pulled out a cell phone and made a call. In the quiet night, they could hear his side of the conversation clearly. "Yeah, "We got 2 witnesses," the man said, his voice hard. "They saw the whole setup. We're tracking them now, but they're moving fast. We're going to need the cleanup crew if we catch them." The casual way the man said "cleanup crew" left no doubt about what he meant. These people were willing to kill to protect their operation. Clarence felt Eugene trembling beside him and put a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder. The men spent nearly 40 minutes searching the area around the intersection, their lights sweeping through the trees, their voices growing more frustrated. Finally, apparently deciding that Clarence and Eugene had continued north on the main trail, they moved on. But Clarence and Eugene remained hidden for another hour, too terrified to move, listening to every sound in the forest. When Clarence finally decided it was safe, they emerged from their hiding spot stiff and cold, rather than continue north on the trail, which is what the men would expect. Clarence made the decision to hike east on the Blue Blaze Trail, which he knew would eventually connect to another Forest Service road. They hiked through the remainder of the night, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that people were hunting them. As dawn broke, they reached a paved road and flagged down the first vehicle they saw, a farmer heading to town in a battered pickup truck. The man took one look at their faces and agreed to drive them to the nearest town without asking questions. From there, they called the authorities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Park police arrived within an hour, followed shortly by DEA agents who seemed very interested in Clarence's description of the shelter location and the men involved. It turned out that the shelter had been under investigation for months as a suspected drug transfer point. But authorities had been unable to catch anyone in the act. Clarence and Eugene's testimony provided the evidence needed to launch a raid. But when officers arrived at the shelter 18 hours later, it was empty. The men had cleared out completely, taking everything with them. They found evidence that the location had been used for illegal activity, tire tracks, disturbed earth, and a few discarded items. But the operation had been abandoned. Dale and his associates were never caught. The case remained open, and authorities warned both Clarence and Eugene that it would be safest to skip the next 50-mile section of trail entirely. Eugene took their advice and got off the trail completely. He called his parents that same day and asked them to come pick him up. His through hike was over. Clarence, however, made a different choice. After a 2-week break to let things cool down, and after receiving assurances from law enforcement that the area was being monitored, he returned to the trail and continued his northbound journey. But Clarence never forgot that night. He never forgot the sound of footsteps in the darkness, the feeling of hiding behind those rocks while men discussed killing him as casually as ordering coffee. He completed his through hike 4 months later, reaching Katahdin in August. But when people asked him about his favorite moments on the trail, he never mentioned Virginia. And when younger hikers asked him for advice, he always told them the same thing. Trust your instincts, and remember that the greatest dangers in the wilderness are not always the ones you expect. Harold Brennan had been planning his photography trip to the Great Smoky Mountains for over a year. At 38 years old, he had built a modest career as a nature photographer, selling prints online and occasionally landing assignments with outdoor magazines. The Smokies in mid-October were legendary for their autumn colors, and Harold had carefully researched the best locations for capturing the fall foliage at its peak. The Appalachian Trail section through the park offered some of the most spectacular vistas, and Harold had planned a 5-day trek that would take him through the highlands, where the elevation provided sweeping views of the mountains rolling away in every direction. He started his hike on a Wednesday morning, his pack loaded with camera equipment, extra batteries, and enough food to last him through the weekend. The weather forecast called for clear skies and unseasonably warm temperatures. Perfect conditions for photography. Harold made good progress on the first day, stopping frequently to set up shots, experimenting with different angles and lighting. By late afternoon on the second day, he reached Spence Field, a high-elevation grassy bald that offered 360-degree views of the surrounding peaks. The shelter at Spence Field was a simple three-sided structure, typical of the AT shelters throughout the Smokies. When Harold arrived around 5 in the evening, he found 3 other hikers already settled in for the night, a couple from Ohio and a solo hiker from Virginia. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, shared information about trail conditions, and prepared their dinners together. Harold mentioned that he planned to camp in his tent rather than sleep in the shelter, wanting the flexibility to wake early for sunrise photography without disturbing the others. As they ate, the conversation turned to the peculiar reputation of Spence Field. The solo hiker, a man in his 60s who had been hiking the AT for years, mentioned casually that many hikers avoided staying in this particular area if they could help it. When Harold asked why, the man shrugged and said that the place had a bad reputation, though he was vague about the details. The couple from Ohio exchanged glances, but said nothing. Harold laughed it off, assuming it was just typical trail superstition. Every popular hiking area had its ghost stories and urban legends. By 7 in the evening, the other hikers had retreated into their sleeping bags. Harold set up his tent about 50 yards from the shelter, choosing a spot that would give him an unobstructed view of the eastern horizon for the sunrise. The evening was remarkably warm for October, and he left his tent flaps partially open to let in the breeze. As darkness settled over the mountains, a thick fog began rolling in, moving across the grassy field in slow, undulating waves. Harold watched it for a while, considering whether it would interfere with his morning photography plans, then eventually crawled into his sleeping bag. He was not sure what time it was when he woke, but the darkness was complete. His watch showed 11:17. Something had pulled him from sleep, some sound that his unconscious mind had registered as wrong. He lay still, listening, trying to identify what had disturbed him. Then he heard it again, the sound of children laughing. The laughter was clear and distinct, multiple voices, the carefree sound of kids playing a game. But there were no children on this isolated section of trail, no families camping nearby. Harold unzipped his sleeping bag and moved to the tent entrance, peering out into the fog-shrouded field. The visibility was terrible, perhaps 15 feet at most. The fog had thickened considerably, turning the landscape into a formless gray void. But the laughter came again, closer now, from somewhere out in that fog. Harold called out, his voice sounding strange and muffled in the dense air. "Hello? Is everything okay? Do you need help?" The laughter stopped instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was absolute, more complete than any silence Harold had experienced. No insects, no wind, no distant sounds of the forest. Just an emptiness that felt somehow hostile. He waited, his heart beginning to pound, wondering if he should go back to the shelter and wake the other hikers. Before he could decide, the laughter started again, but this time it came from multiple directions simultaneously. The voices were circling him, moving through the fog in patterns that made no sense. Harold fumbled for his headlamp and switched it on, the beam cutting weakly through the fog. He swept it back and forth across the field, trying to locate the source of the sounds. For just a moment, he caught sight of something moving at the edge of his light's range, small shadows that darted quickly out of view. They were child-sized, low to the ground, moving with an odd, skittering quality that did not look quite right. He called out again, his voice less steady now. "Who is out there? This is not funny." The response was immediate and chilling. A voice spoke from directly behind his tent, so close that it seemed impossible he had not heard someone approach. The voice was an adult's voice, deep and masculine, but it whispered his name. Harold. Just that, nothing more. His full name, spoken with perfect clarity by someone or something that should not know who he was. Harold spun around, his light sweeping across the area behind his tent. There was nothing there, just grass and fog and the dark line of trees 50 feet away. He scrambled backward, retreating into his tent and zipped it shut with shaking hands. This was not right. None of this was right. He grabbed his hiking poles, the only thing he had that could serve as a weapon, and sat in the center of his tent, listening. The footsteps started a few minutes later. They circled his tent slowly and deliberately, the sound of feet moving through grass, except that the footsteps sounded wrong. There were too many of them, and they did not follow a normal walking rhythm. Harold counted at least 6 or 7 distinct sets of footsteps, all moving around his tent in a slow, synchronized circle. He wanted to scream, wanted to run to the shelter. But some instinct told him that leaving the tent would be a terrible mistake. Then the voices began. They started as whispers. Dozens of overlapping whispers in different tones and pitches, speaking words Harold could not quite make out. The whispers gradually grew louder, resolving into recognizable sounds, and Harold realized with mounting horror that the voices were repeating things he had said earlier. Fragments of his conversation with the other hikers, played back in perfect mimicry. His own voice discussing his photography plans, his concerns about the weather, his casual goodbye to the others. But the voices were not quite right. They had a hollow quality, like recordings played through damaged speakers. Harold pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sounds. But they seemed to come from inside his head as much as from outside the tent. The circling footsteps continued, never pausing, never stopping. Hours passed, though Harold had lost all sense of time. His watch showed midnight, then 1 in the morning, then 2. The voices never stopped their horrible mimicry, cycling through everything he had said, sometimes playing phrases backward, sometimes overlapping multiple recordings until they became a chaotic cacophony. At some point after 2 in the morning, the tent zipper began to move. Harold watched in frozen terror as the zipper slowly, deliberately opened from the outside. He had locked it, he was certain of that. But it opened anyway, the tab moving smoothly down as though pulled by invisible fingers. Through the widening gap, Harold could see the fog outside, but there was nothing else visible. No hand, no person, nothing to explain how the zipper was moving. Then he saw the hand. It reached through the opening, pale and elongated, with fingers that had too many joints. The fingers bent at angles that human fingers could not achieve, flexing and stretching as they groped inside the tent, searching. Harold kicked at the hand with all his strength, connecting solidly with what felt like cold, rubbery flesh. The hand withdrew instantly, and the tent zipper snapped shut again. Immediately, the voices outside changed. They stopped their mimicry and began to scream. But it was Harold's scream they were making. His own voice, his own terror, played back at him from a dozen sources at once. The sound was overwhelming, disorienting, and Harold found himself screaming too, adding his real voice to the chorus of false ones until he could not tell which was which. The screaming continued for what felt like hours. Harold huddled in his tent, hiking poles held in white-knuckled fists, convinced that he was losing his mind. But gradually, so slowly that he almost did not notice at first, the sounds began to fade. The screaming voices grew quieter, more distant. The circling footsteps slowed and eventually stopped. By the time Harold's watch showed 4 a.m, the only sound was his own ragged breathing. He did not dare move, did not dare investigate. He sat in his tent, staring at the zipped entrance, waiting for the attack to resume. But as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, normal sounds returned to the forest. A bird called somewhere in the distance. A breeze rustled the grass. The fog began to thin, revealing the familiar shapes of the landscape around him. When full daylight arrived, Harold finally found the courage to unzip his tent and look outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The grass around his tent was covered in small handprints, dozens of them pressed deep into the earth. But these were not normal handprints. Each one had 6 fingers, and the fingers were far too long, the proportions all wrong. The prints formed a complete circle around his tent, overlapping in places, as though many small hands had pressed themselves into the ground. Harold grabbed his camera with shaking hands and photographed everything. The handprints, the disturbed grass, the entire area around his tent. He did not pack his camping gear, did not stop to make breakfast, did not even go to the shelter to check on the other hikers. He stuffed his camera and essential gear into his pack, abandoned everything else, and started hiking down the trail at a near run. He did not stop until he reached the next road crossing, nearly 8 miles away. From there, he hitched a ride into Gatlinburg and went directly to an outdoor outfitter store he had visited before starting his hike. The owner was a local man in his 70s who had grown up in the shadow of the Smokies. When Harold showed him the photographs on his camera, the man's face went pale. "Where did you take these?" the owner asked quietly. "Spence Field," Harold replied. "Last night." "What are they?" The owner was silent for a long moment, studying the images of the 6-fingered handprints. Finally, he looked up at Harold with an expression of deep unease. "You know where you were camping? That whole area before it became a national park, that was Cherokee land, sacred ground. There are stories about that place, old stories that most people think are just legends. The Cherokee talked about the Nunahai, the spirit people. They were supposed to be immortal beings that lived in the high places, and they could take different forms. Sometimes they appeared as children, playing and laughing, trying to lure travelers away from the trails." Harold felt his skin crawl. But the handprints, 6 fingers. "The old stories described them that way," the owner said. "Not quite human, even when they looked human. The Cherokee avoided certain areas in the mountains because of the Nunahai. Spence Field was one of those places. Some say it was a burial ground. Others say it was a doorway between worlds. Either way, it was not a place to spend the night." Harold completed his photography trip, but he avoided the Smokies entirely, choosing instead to photograph the North Carolina sections of the trail. He eventually made it to Maine and got some excellent shots, but he never went back to Spence Field. The photographs he took that morning remained on his memory card, but he never published them, never showed them to anyone except that outfitter in Gatlinburg. Years later, Harold still has nightmares about that night. He dreams of children laughing in the fog, of hands with too many fingers reaching for him, of voices that know his name. And sometimes, in his dreams, he unzips his tent and looks outside to find hundreds of small figures standing in the darkness, all of them staring at him with eyes that reflect his headlamp's light like animals. In those dreams, he always hears the same whispered invitation, spoken in his own voice, calling him to join them in the fog. Agnes and Beatrice Thornton had been hiking together for over 30 years. The sisters, now 62 and 59 respectively, had discovered their love for the outdoors as young women growing up in rural Ohio. And hiking had remained a constant in their lives through marriages, careers, children, and eventually retirement. They were experienced, competent hikers who knew their limits and planned their trips with the kind of careful attention that came from decades of practice. The Pennsylvania section of the Appalachian Trail was familiar territory to them, having hiked portions of it several times over the years. It was early March when they decided to tackle a section they had completed once before, a moderately challenging stretch through Michaud State Forest. The timing was intentional. They wanted to hike before the spring crowds arrived, and they were prepared for the possibility of encountering late-season snow. What they were not prepared for was the sudden storm that rolled in on their second day. A freak weather system that brought heavy snow and plummeting temperatures completely at odds with the forecast they had checked that morning. They had been making good progress when the first flakes began to fall around 2 in the afternoon. Within an hour, the snow was coming down heavily, and visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Agnes, the older and more cautious of the two sisters, suggested they find shelter immediately rather than push on to their planned campsite. Beatrice agreed without argument. The temperature was falling rapidly, and the wind was picking up. This was not a storm to be caught in without protection. Agnes remembered a shelter from their previous hike through this area, an older structure that was not marked on the official trail maps anymore, but had still been standing the last time they passed through. It was only about a quarter-mile off the main trail, if her memory was correct. They found the side trail easily enough, a narrow path nearly obscured by undergrowth, and followed it into the deepening forest. The shelter appeared through the swirling snow, exactly where Agnes remembered it. The structure was old, probably built decades ago by the Civilian Conservation Corps, with rough-hewn log walls and a sagging roof that had somehow remained mostly intact. It was not much to look at, but it offered protection from the wind and snow, and that was all that mattered. The sisters pushed through the doorway, grateful to be out of the storm. Inside, they found they were not alone. An elderly woman sat near a small fire in the center of the shelter, tending the flames with a piece of dead wood. She looked up as they entered, and her face broke into a warm smile. She was dressed strangely, wearing what looked like a long woolen dress from another era, dark and heavy, with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was white and pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was deeply lined with age. "Welcome, travelers," the woman said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Come warm yourselves. The mountain is angry today." Agnes and Beatrice exchanged glances, but moved toward the fire gratefully. The woman seemed harmless enough, and her presence actually made the situation feel less isolated. They introduced themselves, and the woman nodded as if she had been expecting them. "I am Mildred," she said simply. "I am the keeper of this place." The phrasing struck Agnes as odd, but she was too cold and tired to dwell on it. They set down their packs and held their hands out to the fire, feeling the warmth gradually return to their frozen fingers. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind howling through the trees and rattling the shelter's old timbers. Snow blew in through gaps in the walls, and the temperature continued to drop. Agnes realized with growing concern that they might be stuck here for quite some time. Mildred seemed content with the silence for a while, simply staring into the flames. But eventually, she spoke again, her tone conversational, but with an underlying seriousness. "Have you brought an offering for the mountain?" Beatrice looked at her with confusion. "An offering? What do you mean?" "It is tradition," Mildred said, not looking up from the fire. Travelers who seek shelter in the high places must leave something of value. It is the old way. The mountain provides protection, but it must be honored in return. Agnes forced a polite smile. I think we will be fine without any offerings. We just need to wait out the storm, and then we will be on our way. Mildred finally looked up, and her eyes were sharp and penetrating despite her age. You do not understand. The mountain does not give without receiving. If you refuse the tradition, the path will close. You will not leave here. The statement hung in the air, and Agnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was something in the woman's tone, a certainty that went beyond simple superstition. Beatrice laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. Well, we do not really have anything valuable with us, just hiking gear. Something precious, Mildred insisted. Something that has meaning to you. That is what the mountain requires. Agnes was about to dismiss the entire conversation as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman when she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Outside the shelter, the storm was growing worse. But it was not just intensifying naturally. The wind seemed to be centered on the shelter itself, as if the building were the focus of the storm's rage. Snow was piling up against the entrance at an alarming rate, and the temperature inside the shelter was dropping despite the fire. Beatrice noticed it too. Agnes, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. This is not normal. Mildred rose to her feet with surprising ease for someone of her apparent age. Her demeanor had changed completely. The warm smile was gone, replaced by an expression of cold demand. The mountain takes what it is owed. You came here seeking shelter. Shelter has been granted. But nothing is free in the high places. Give your offering, or the storm will not pass. The path will close. You will join the others who refused. Agnes wanted to argue, wanted to laugh it off as nonsense. But the storm outside was becoming impossible to ignore. The snow had already blocked half the doorway. The wind was so loud it sounded like screaming. And the temperature, despite the fire that should have been warming the small space, continued to fall. Her breath was visible in the air, and her fingers were going numb again. Beatrice was shaking, and Agnes could not tell if it was from cold or fear. Agnes, what do we do? This is insane, Agnes said, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked at Mildred, at the implacable certainty in the old woman's eyes, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. What kind of offering? Something you love, Mildred said. Something that binds you to your old life. The mountain hungers for such things. Beatrice was already moving, reaching into her pack with trembling hands. She pulled out a small jewelry bag and opened it, removing a simple gold wedding ring. It had been on her finger for 32 years before arthritis had forced her to start wearing it on a chain around her neck instead. It was the most valuable thing she owned, not in monetary terms, but in meaning. She held it for a moment, tears streaming down her face, then walked to the corner of the shelter where a crude altar of stacked stones sat against the wall. Agnes had not noticed the altar before, but now it seemed impossible to miss. The stones were old, covered in moss and strange markings that might have been symbols or might have been nothing more than weathering. Beatrice placed the ring on top of the stones, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The moment the ring touched the stones, everything changed. The wind stopped, not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had closed a door. The howling ceased, and in its place came an eerie silence. The temperature in the shelter immediately began to rise. Outside, through the half-blocked doorway, Agnes could see that the snow had stopped falling. Mildred smiled, the warm expression returning to her face. "The mountain accepts your offering. You will have safe passage." She turned and walked toward the back wall of the shelter, her movements slow and deliberate. Agnes watched in disbelief as the old woman walked directly into the solid log wall and disappeared, not passing through a door or opening, but simply ceasing to exist as she made contact with the wood. Beatrice screamed and stumbled backward. Agnes rushed to the wall, running her hands over the rough logs, searching for any gap or trick. But the wall was completely solid. There was no door, no opening, no way anyone could have passed through. She looked at her sister, and in that moment, they both understood that they had experienced something that should not have been possible. They did not sleep that night. They sat by the fire, which continued to burn without anyone adding wood to it, and waited for dawn. Neither spoke. When the first light of morning finally crept through the doorway, they grabbed their packs and fled the shelter without looking back. The ring was gone from the altar. Agnes checked, hoping desperately that it had just fallen and could be recovered. But there was no sign of it anywhere. The stones were bare, and the strange markings she had seen the night before were no longer visible. The storm had passed completely, and the morning was clear and cold. They hiked directly to the nearest road crossing and called for a ride. While they waited, Beatrice could not stop crying. "That was my wedding ring," she kept saying. 32 years. How am I going to explain this to Michael? 2 days later, after they had returned home and tried to process what had happened, they decided to report the experience. They drove back to the area with a park ranger, determined to prove that the shelter existed, that something inexplicable had occurred. But when they reached the location where the shelter should have been, they found only a cleared area with old foundation stones. The ranger consulted his maps and records and confirmed that a shelter had indeed stood there once, but it had burned down in 1943. There had been one casualty in the fire, a woman who served as a volunteer shelter keeper. Her name, according to the historical records, was Mildred Chenoweth. The ranger showed them a photograph from the park archives, a black and white image from 1942 showing the shelter in its prime. Standing in front of it was a woman in a long, dark dress with a shawl around her shoulders. The resemblance to the woman they had met was unmistakable. Beatrice never recovered her ring. She told her husband she had lost it on the trail, and he was understanding. But the lie sat between them like a weight. Her marriage, which had been strong for over 3 decades, began to deteriorate. Small arguments became large fights. Trust eroded. Within 6 months, they had separated. And a year after that night in the shelter, the divorce was finalized. Agnes and Beatrice still hiked together occasionally, but they never returned to Pennsylvania. They never speak about what happened in that shelter, about Mildred, about the offering. But both sisters know that some bargains, once made, cannot be undone. The mountain took what it was owed, and the price was far higher than a simple ring. Stanley Morrison prided himself on being meticulous. At 29 years old, the IT professional from Seattle had quit his job specifically to attempt a southbound through hike of the Appalachian Trail, a decision that baffled his coworkers but made perfect sense to him. Stanley liked control, liked knowing exactly where he was and what was happening at all times. It was this personality trait that made him an excellent systems analyst and an obsessive trail journaler. Every evening, without fail, Stanley would sit in his tent or at a shelter and record every detail of his day in a leather-bound journal. Miles hiked, elevation gained and lost, weather conditions, people encountered, food consumed, water sources used, and detailed notes about his physical and mental state. He logged everything with the precision of someone documenting a scientific experiment. His friends joked that his journal entries were detailed enough that someone could retrace his exact steps years later and recreate his entire experience. By early September, Stanley had made it to Vermont, and his journal showed that he was on track to finish his through hike by late October. He was in excellent physical condition, his gear was dialed in, and he was averaging around 20 miles per day with consistent ease. The Vermont section was beautiful, with the leaves just beginning to turn and the weather still warm enough for comfortable camping. Stanley was feeling confident and strong. On the evening of September 7th, he camped alone at a small clearing about 2 miles south of Glastonbury Mountain, an area known for its rugged terrain and limited water sources. His journal entry that night was characteristically detailed. He recorded that he had hiked 18.3 miles, consumed 2,400 calories, filtered 3 liters of water from a small stream, and planned to wake at 6 in the morning to complete another 18-mile day that would take him past Glastonbury and on toward Stratton Mountain. His entry concluded with a note that he felt slightly more tired than usual, but attributed it to the challenging terrain. He set his alarm, checked his GPS to confirm his location, and went to sleep. When Stanley woke, his alarm was beeping insistently, and sunlight was streaming through his tent. He checked his watch and saw that it showed 6:03 in the morning, exactly as planned. He went through his usual morning routine with practiced efficiency, breaking down his tent, eating breakfast, and starting down the trail by 7 o'clock. He remembered making the decision to take the main trail rather than a bypass route, remembered checking his map, remembered adjusting his pack straps for comfort. The next thing Stanley clearly remembered was sitting on the trail in near darkness, confused and disoriented. He looked at his watch and saw that it read 7:45, but the sun was setting rather than rising. He was no longer where he remembered being. In fact, he had no idea where he was. With shaking hands, he pulled out his GPS device and waited for it to acquire a signal. When the coordinates appeared, Stanley felt his confusion deepen into something approaching panic. According to the GPS, he was 31 miles north of where he had started that morning. He had somehow covered not the planned 18 miles, but over 30 miles, and he had absolutely no memory of hiking them. He looked at his phone, hoping to find some explanation, and saw that it was indeed 7:45 in the evening. 12 hours and 45 minutes had passed since he started hiking, and he could remember perhaps the first 30 minutes. Stanley opened his journal with trembling fingers, hoping that he had made notes during the day that might explain the gap. What he found made his blood run cold. There was an entry dated that day, written in his own handwriting, but he had absolutely no memory of writing it. The entry was brief and cryptic. They showed me the pattern. I understand now. The trees know the way. The numbers spiral. 8 becomes infinity. I have been here before. I will be here again. The words made no sense. Stanley never wrote like that. His entries were factual, precise, devoid of any mysticism or vague philosophizing. He stared at the page, trying to recognize his own thoughts in those sentences. But it was as if someone else had possessed his hand and written in his style. He checked the rest of his gear, looking for more clues. His water bottles were empty, though he distinctly remembered filling them at breakfast. His food bag was lighter, indicating he had eaten lunch and snacks, but he had no memory of stopping to eat. Then he noticed his boots. They were caked with red clay, thick and dried, covering the soles and creeping up the sides. Stanley knew the soil in Vermont was not red. He had been hiking through this region for over a week, and the ground was consistently dark brown or gray. Red clay was not something he had encountered anywhere on the trail in this state. He tried to scrape some of it off, and it came away in hard chunks, as if it had been walked through while wet and then baked dry. Stanley pulled out his smartphone, hoping the photo app might provide answers. What he found was both illuminating and deeply disturbing. The phone showed 68 photographs taken between 2:15 and 6:20 in the afternoon, during the hours he could not remember. He began scrolling through them with mounting dread. The photos showed him at various locations along the trail. He recognized some of the landmarks from his maps, confirming that he had indeed hiked over 30 miles. But the photos were wrong in ways he could not fully articulate. In some, he appeared to be off trail entirely, standing in dense forest where no path was visible. In others, he was photographing specific trees, taking close-up shots of their bark. When he zoomed in on these images, he saw that the bark had been carved with geometric symbols, intricate patterns of lines, and circles that formed configurations he did not recognize but found strangely compelling. Several photos appeared to be selfies, taken by holding the phone at arm's length. In these images, Stanley was smiling widely, his eyes strangely vacant, his expression completely at odds with his normal demeanor. He never took selfies. He found them pointless and narcissistic. Yet here were dozens of images of himself grinning at the camera with an expression that looked more like a mask than genuine emotion. The final photograph was the most disturbing. It showed a view looking straight up through the forest canopy, the phone aimed at the sky. Between the branches, barely visible but unmistakably present, were dark shapes. They were too large to be birds, too irregular in form to be aircraft. They hung in the air like enormous shadows, and though the image was slightly blurred, Stanley could see what looked like appendages extending from the shapes, thin and numerous, reaching down toward the forest floor. Stanley checked his GPS tracker, the device that had been passively logging his movements all day. He pulled up the data and stared at the route he had supposedly walked. It made no sense. The tracks showed him moving in an impossible zigzag pattern, covering more than 40 miles in 6 hours while simultaneously doubling back over his own route multiple times. The elevation data showed him climbing and descending thousands of feet in ways that did not match the terrain. It was as if he had been moving at superhuman speed, or as if space itself had been folding around him as he walked. Stanley spent the night at the next shelter, arriving well after dark and disturbing several sleeping hikers with his arrival. He did not sleep. He sat with his back against the shelter wall, his headlamp on, reviewing the photos and GPS data over and over, trying to find a rational explanation. By morning, he had come to only one conclusion. Something had happened to him during those lost hours, something he could not explain and could not remember. And whatever it was had changed him in ways he did not yet understand. At the next town, he went to the local urgent care clinic and requested a full medical workup. The doctor was skeptical but thorough, running blood tests, checking for signs of head trauma, asking questions about drug use that Stanley answered honestly. Everything came back normal. No drugs in his system, no medical conditions that might explain memory loss, no signs of physical injury. The doctor suggested he might have experienced a dissociative episode brought on by the stress and isolation of solo hiking and recommended he take a few days off the trail to rest. But Stanley knew it was not stress. He felt fine physically. His mind was clear now, even if it had not been during those lost hours. Something had happened on that trail. Something that existed outside the boundaries of normal experience. He contacted the Park Service and filed a detailed report, including copies of his GPS data and selected photographs. A researcher reached out to him 2 days later, a woman from a private organization that investigated unusual occurrences in wilderness areas. The researcher told him that he was not alone. Since 2019, 8 other hikers had reported similar experiences in that specific section of Vermont Trail. All described lost time ranging from 2 hours to an entire day. All had GPS data showing impossible travel patterns. All had photographs they did not remember taking, many featuring the same carved symbols on trees. And all reported finding red clay on their boots despite the local soil being completely different in composition. Stanley completed his through hike, reaching Springer Mountain in Georgia 2 months later. But the experience had changed him fundamentally. His journal entries after that day were less detailed, less confident. He stopped tracking every mile and calorie with obsessive precision. He had learned that control was an illusion, that there were things in the world that could not be measured or logged or understood through data. He still has the photographs on his phone. He still has the journal entry he does not remember writing. And he still has recurring dreams, vivid and unsettling, in which he walks through forests that shift and spiral around him, while voices whisper about patterns he is beginning to comprehend. In those dreams, he sees the symbols from the tree bark, and he understands them perfectly. But when he wakes, the meaning slips away, leaving only a profound sense that something in those Vermont woods had touched his mind and left a mark that would never fade. Norman Chen and Ralph Donnelly had been friends since their freshman year at Penn State, where they had bonded over a shared love of hiking and a mutual inability to sit still through boring lectures. That was 23 years ago. Now both men were in their mid-40s, settled into careers and family life. But they made a point of taking at least one hiking trip together each year. It was their way of maintaining a friendship that might otherwise have faded into occasional social media comments and annual holiday cards. This year they had chosen a week-long section hike through the Roan Highlands, a spectacularly beautiful stretch of the Appalachian Trail that straddles the North Carolina and Tennessee border. Mid-July was perhaps not the ideal time for hiking in the South, with temperatures pushing into the 90s and humidity making every climb feel twice as difficult. But their work schedules had not allowed for any other timing. They had started their hike on a Monday morning and were now on their 3rd day, making steady progress despite the heat. They arrived at the shelter around 6 in the evening, both men exhausted and drenched in sweat. The shelter was already crowded, a 3-sided structure with 2 sleeping platforms that were nearly full. Norman counted 8 other hikers, a mix of through hikers and section hikers like themselves. There was one remaining space on the upper platform, just barely large enough for both of them if they squeezed together. They claimed the spot gratefully, glad to have a roof over their heads for the night. As they unpacked their gear and began preparing dinner, Norman noticed one hiker who stood out from the others. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, sat alone in the far corner of the upper platform. He faced the wall rather than the communal space, and his gear was unlike anything Norman had seen on the trail. The backpack looked like it was from the 1970s, an old external frame pack in faded green canvas. The sleeping bag was the same era, a bulky rectangular bag that probably weighed 10 pounds. Even the man's clothes seemed vintage, worn blue jeans and a flannel shirt instead of modern hiking apparel. "Check out that guy's gear," Ralph whispered, nodding toward the old man. "That stuff belongs in a museum." Norman agreed, but said nothing. The trail attracted all types, And who was he to judge someone's equipment choices? But there was something about the man that made him uncomfortable. Something beyond just the outdated gear. The man had not acknowledged their arrival, had not made eye contact or offered any greeting. He just sat there facing the wall, perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. As darkness fell and the other hikers settled into their sleeping bags, the shelter grew quiet. Norman was just drifting off to sleep when he heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner where the old man sat. Norman opened his eyes and listened. The man was speaking, a continuous stream of words too quiet to make out. Norman assumed he was praying or perhaps talking to himself, something that was not uncommon among solo hikers who spent too much time alone. He closed his eyes again and tried to ignore it. But the whispering continued, hour after hour. Norman could not sleep through it, and from the way Ralph kept shifting position, neither could his friend. The words were rhythmic, repetitive, like a chant or litany. Norman caught occasional words that sounded like names. Sarah, Michael, Jennifer, David. The names went on and on, different names, always whispered in the same flat, emotionless tone. Around 2 a.m, Norman had had enough. He sat up and looked toward the corner, intending to politely ask the man to keep it down. What he saw made him freeze. The old man was sitting upright, no longer facing the wall. Instead, he was staring directly at Norman, his eyes clearly visible even in the darkness. The whispered name stopped immediately, and the silence that followed felt oppressive. "You should not have brought him here," the old man said, his voice no longer a whisper but clear and distinct. Everyone in the shelter was awake now, and Norman could feel Ralph tense beside him. "Excuse me," Norman said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "I do not understand what you mean." The old man's gaze shifted to Ralph, and he raised one skeletal finger to point directly at him. "He knows what he did. The mountain knows. They all know." Ralph sat up abruptly, his face pale even in the dim light. "What are you talking about? I do not know you." 15 years ago, the old man said, his voice taking on a strange quality, hollow and echoing. "August 23rd, Route 17. The passenger died. You walked away. You let them believe it was not your fault." The shelter had gone completely silent. Every hiker was awake and listening now. Norman turned to look at his friend and saw an expression on Ralph's face that confirmed what the old man was saying. It was an expression of pure terror and guilt, the look of someone whose deepest secret had just been exposed. "Ralph?" Norman said quietly. "What is he talking about?" Ralph was shaking, his breath coming in short gasps. "I do not know how he knows that. I never told anyone. Nobody knows." The old man stood, moving with an ease that seemed at odds with his apparent age. He began walking toward Ralph, his steps slow and deliberate. "You brought yourself here. This is your reckoning place. The mountain calls those who carry guilt. The mountain demands truth." Norman watched in horror as the old man continued his approach, and he could see now that there was something fundamentally wrong about him. His movements were too smooth, too fluid. His eyes did not blink, and as he drew closer, Norman realized he could not hear the man breathing. "There was an accident," Ralph said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I was driving home from a party. My friend Jake was with me. I had been drinking, not a lot, but enough that I should not have been driving. I missed a curve and hit a tree. Jake died, but when the cops came, I told them he had been driving. I switched seats while I was waiting for help. Everyone believed me. His family buried him thinking he was responsible for his own death. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Several of the other hikers had pulled out their phones, and Norman could see in the glow of their screens that they were recording this. Someone suggested calling the authorities. Someone else said they should all leave the shelter immediately. The old man stopped directly in front of Ralph, close enough to touch him. "You brought yourself here. This is your reckoning place." Ralph broke. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag, grabbed his headlamp, and ran from the shelter into the darkness. Norman called after him, but Ralph did not stop. Norman and two other hikers grabbed their own lights and followed, leaving their packs behind. They found Ralph about 100 yards down the trail, sitting on the ground with his back against a tree, sobbing. Norman approached slowly, uncertain what to say. His friend of over 20 years had just confessed to a crime, had just admitted to lying about a death, had destroyed someone's memory to save himself. Norman did not know how to process it. "I need to go back," Ralph said between gasps. "I need to turn myself in. I cannot live with this anymore." The other hikers agreed to stay with Ralph while Norman returned to the shelter to get their gear. As he approached the structure, he noticed something strange. The shelter was completely silent. He climbed back up to the platform and looked toward the corner where the old man had been sitting. The space was empty. The vintage backpack was gone. The sleeping bag was gone. It was as if the man had never been there at all. Norman asked the other hikers where the old man had gone, but they all looked at him with confusion. One woman, a through hiker from Colorado, said she had not seen anyone leave the shelter. Norman insisted that the old man had been there, had spoken to Ralph, but as he looked around at the faces of the other hikers, he saw only uncertainty. "What was his name?" one of them asked. "Did he sign the register?" Norman grabbed the shelter register, a notebook kept in a plastic bag near the entrance. He flipped through the pages, looking for any entry from the old man. There was nothing. Every hiker currently in the shelter had signed in, but there was no entry for anyone matching the description of the man who had confronted Ralph. They searched the area around the shelter with flashlights, looking for any sign that the old man had been there, any footprints or dropped gear or evidence of his presence. They found nothing. Norman checked his pack, wondering if he had been so tired that he had hallucinated the entire encounter. But Ralph's confession was real. The other hikers had heard it. Some had recorded it. Ralph left the trail the next morning. Norman helped him hike out to the nearest road crossing, where Ralph's wife came to pick him up. Within a week, Ralph had contacted an attorney and turned himself in to the authorities. The case made local news. A 15-year-old hit-and-run death finally solved through an unexpected confession on the Appalachian Trail. Norman completed the section hike alone, but he could not stop thinking about the old man in the shelter. At the next town, he stopped at an outfitter and asked if anyone knew about hikers who used vintage gear. The owner listened to his description and went pale. He pulled out a worn newspaper clipping from 1978. It showed a photograph of a man who looked exactly like the person Norman had seen. The man's name was Albert Grayson, and he had been murdered in that same shelter 47 years ago by his hiking partner during an argument. The killer was never caught. Gertrude Walsh and Doris Campbell had been best friends for over 50 years, having met as young teachers at the same elementary school in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now both retired, at 68 and 71 respectively. They had more time than ever to pursue their shared passion for hiking. They were careful hikers, always aware of their limitations, always prepared with proper gear and conservative itineraries. Their families trusted them completely, knowing that the two women had enough collective wisdom and experience to handle any situation the trail might present. Late May had seemed like the perfect time for a 3-day section hike through the North Carolina portion of the Appalachian Trail. The weather was warm but not oppressively hot, and the crowds of summer had not yet arrived. They had planned their route carefully, with modest daily mileages and well-established campsites. On their second evening, they aimed to reach Mack's Patch, a spectacular grassy bald mountain summit that offered 360-degree views of the surrounding peaks. It was one of the most photographed locations on the entire trail, and both women had been looking forward to camping there and watching the sunset. They arrived at the summit around 7 in the evening, making good time and feeling strong despite the steep climb. The summit was exactly as beautiful as the guidebooks had promised. A vast, open meadow sitting atop the mountain, with views that stretched for miles in every direction. The sky was clear, and the evening light was turning everything golden. It should have been perfect. But as they crested the final rise and looked around, both women felt an immediate sense of wrongness. The summit was completely empty. On a perfect Friday evening in late May, one of the most popular camping spots on the trail was utterly deserted. No tents, no other hikers, no one taking photographs or enjoying the sunset. Gertrude and Doris exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected to share the space with at least a dozen other campers, possibly more. The isolation felt unnatural. "Maybe everyone is still on their way up," Doris suggested, though she sounded uncertain. "Or maybe they went to the shelters instead." Gertrude nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in her stomach. They chose a flat spot near the center of the summit and began setting up their tents. The process was familiar and comforting, and by the time they had camp established and were preparing their dinner, the unease had faded somewhat. The sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. Both women took dozens of photographs, trying to capture the beauty of the moment. As the sun disappeared and darkness settled over the mountain, Doris commented on the unusual color of the sky. Even after the sun was gone, the purple hue remained, deeper and more saturated than any twilight sky she had ever seen. Gertrude agreed that it was strange, but attributed it to atmospheric conditions she did not understand. They finished their dinner and began preparing for sleep. It was Doris who first noticed the stars. She had stepped outside her tent to hang her food bag from the bear cables and found herself staring up at the night sky in confusion. "Gertrude," she called out, her voice tight. "Come look at this." Gertrude emerged from her tent and followed Doris's gaze upward. The stars were wrong, not just slightly off, but completely incorrect. The constellations were not where they should have been. The Big Dipper was too low on the horizon. Orion was visible, which made no sense in late May. The North Star was in the wrong position. It was as if the entire night sky had been rearranged by someone who only vaguely understood how it was supposed to look. "We are just disremembering," Gertrude said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It has been a long day. We are tired." But the wrongness of the sky was undeniable, and both women felt the unease returning, stronger now. The temperature was dropping faster than it should have, and Gertrude could see her breath in the air, which seemed impossible given that it had been nearly 70 degrees at sunset. They decided to get into their tents and try to sleep, hoping that morning would bring clarity and normalcy. Around 9 o'clock, they heard the sound of footsteps on the trail. Multiple people were approaching the summit, and Gertrude felt a wave of relief. Other hikers meant witnesses, company, normalcy. She called out a greeting, her voice friendly and welcoming. The footsteps grew closer, and headlamps became visible bobbing up the trail. A group of 7 hikers emerged onto the summit, their lights cutting through the darkness. But when Gertrude called out again, offering a hello and asking where they had hiked from, the group did not respond. They walked past her tent without acknowledgement, without even glancing in her direction, as if she were completely invisible to them. Gertrude looked at Doris, who had also emerged from her tent, and saw her own confusion reflected on her friend's face. The group of hikers moved to a spot about 50 feet away and began setting up camp. But something was deeply wrong with what they were watching. The hikers moved in complete silence. There was no sound of tent fabric rustling, no clink of tent stakes being hammered, no conversation, no sound of gear being unpacked. It was like watching a silent film, all visual motion with absolutely no accompanying audio. "This is not right," Doris whispered, moving closer to Gertrude. "What is happening?" Gertrude watched the silent group, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Then she noticed something that made her heart skip. One of the hikers was wearing a distinctive jacket, bright red with a large patch on the back. She recognized that jacket. She had seen it before in a photograph at the visitor center, a memorial photograph of a hiker who had died on the trail. The memory came back clearly. The woman had died 3 years ago in a lightning strike, somewhere on this very mountain. "Doris," Gertrude said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think those people are not alive." The words sounded absurd, even as she spoke them, but Doris did not laugh or argue. She was staring at the group with wide eyes, and Gertrude could see that she had come to the same impossible conclusion. They were watching ghosts, spirits, some kind of replay of events that had already happened. As if responding to their realization, the 7 silent hikers suddenly stopped their setup activities. In perfect unison, all 7 turned to face Gertrude and Doris. 7 pairs of eyes, some reflecting the moonlight in ways that human eyes should not, stared directly at them. Then, moving as one, the hikers raised their arms and pointed down the northern trail, the path that led off the summit toward the next valley. The gesture was urgent, insistent, a clear warning. Gertrude did not hesitate. "We need to leave, right now." They abandoned their tents and gear, grabbing only their headlamps and essential items. Neither woman looked back at the ghost hikers as they started down the northern trail, moving as quickly as they dared in the darkness. The path was steep and rocky, treacherous in the dark, but fear drove them forward. They hiked for over 3 hours, covering ground they would normally take twice as long to traverse, until they finally reached the next shelter around 11 o'clock at night. The shelter was occupied by 3 living, breathing hikers who were startled by their sudden arrival, but confirmed that yes, they could see and hear them, that they were real and present. Gertrude and Doris collapsed on the shelter platform, exhausted and shaking. They said nothing about what they had seen, claiming only that they had left Max Patch due to concerning weather. The next morning, they returned to Max Patch with a park ranger to retrieve their abandoned tents. The ranger was annoyed at what he considered an overreaction, but he agreed to escort them. When they reached the summit, they found their tents exactly as they had left them, untouched and undisturbed. There was no sign of any other camp, no footprints in the grass, no indication that 7 people had been there the night before. As they were packing up their gear, the ranger received a radio call. His expression changed as he listened, and when he signed off, he turned to look at the 2 women with new respect. A severe storm system had moved through the area overnight, bringing dangerous lightning strikes. The storm had hit Max Patch Summit directly around 3 in the morning, and the ranger explained that anyone camping on the exposed summit would have been in extreme danger, possibly fatal danger. "You two made the right call leaving when you did," he said. That storm came out of nowhere. Weather Service did not even predict it until after midnight. Gertrude and Doris said nothing, but they understood. The ghost hikers had warned them, had pointed them off the mountain, had saved their lives. Later, they did research and confirmed what Gertrude had suspected. 7 hikers had died on Max Patch in a lightning strike in 2021, caught on the exposed summit during a sudden storm. A memorial had been erected at the base of the mountain, with photographs of all 7 victims. They completed their section hike, but the experience had changed something fundamental in both women. They returned to Max Patch the following spring, carrying flowers that they left at the memorial. It became an annual pilgrimage, their way of honoring the 7 spirits who had reached across the boundary between life and death, to save 2 elderly teachers from sharing their fate. And every time they visit, they'd look up at the summit and wonder if the ghost hikers are still up there, still trying to warn others away from danger, still unable to leave the place where their lives ended.